Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive up to Mirror Lake that Saturday morning felt different somehow. Like the forest was holding its breath. At 29, I'd been doing nature photography professionally for about 6 years, and I'd hiked that particular trail maybe 40 times before. The parking area at the trailhead was almost empty when I arrived around 7 in the morning, just 2 other cars there, which was perfect for what I needed. I wanted to catch the early morning mist rolling off the lake surface, that golden hour light that makes everything look like a painting. My backpack was loaded with my usual gear, my Canon with 3 different lenses, the carbon fiber tripod that cost me a month's rent, protein bars, 2 water bottles, and my emergency whistle that my sister Nancy made me promise to always carry after she watched some documentary about missing hikers. The first mile of the trail was exactly how I remembered it from previous trips. Pine needles crunching under my boots, birds calling out their morning songs, that fresh mountain air filling my lungs. But around the 2nd mile marker, where the path curves near that old fallen oak tree, I noticed something strange. There were these marks on several trees, about 8 feet up from the ground, like something had been scraping the bark off in long, deliberate strips. Not random like a bear would do when marking territory, but almost methodical, forming these weird patterns that reminded me of some kind of script or symbols. The exposed wood underneath was still wet with sap, meaning whatever made these marks had done it recently, maybe within the last day or 2. I took a few shots of them, thinking it might be some interesting natural phenomenon I could research later, but when I checked the photos on my camera's LCD screen, they all came out strangely overexposed in just those specific areas where the marks were, even though my settings were perfect for the lighting conditions. About 30 minutes later, I reached the spot where the trail opens up, and you get your first view of Mirror Lake. The water was perfectly still, like glass reflecting the mountains and sky so clearly, you could barely tell where the real world ended and the reflection began. But there was no mist. In all my years photographing this lake, there had always been morning mist in weather conditions like these, with the cool night air meeting the warmer water. The absence of it felt wrong, like seeing a person without their shadow. I set up my tripod anyway near my favorite spot, this little rocky outcrop that juts out about 10 feet into the water, and started taking some long exposure shots. Through my viewfinder, I kept noticing this dark shape in the tree line on the opposite shore, maybe 300 yards away. It looked like a person standing perfectly still, but when I'd lower the camera to look with my naked eyes, I couldn't make out anything unusual in those trees. The temperature dropped suddenly while I was switching lenses. I mean, dropped hard, like going from a mild spring morning to late fall in the span of maybe 2 minutes. My breath started coming out in these thick clouds, and frost actually began forming on the metal parts of my tripod. This was mid-May in California, and the weather forecast had said it would be in the 60s all day. I pulled out my phone to check the weather app, but I had no signal, which was weird because I usually get at least 1 or 2 bars up at the lake. The screen kept flickering too, showing these strange horizontal lines like an old TV with bad reception, even though I'd just charged it fully that morning. That's when I heard it, this low humming sound coming from somewhere across the lake, not mechanical like a drone or an engine, but organic somehow, almost like throat singing but deeper, so deep I could feel it vibrating in my chest cavity. I decided to pack up and head back to the car, every instinct in my body suddenly screaming at me to leave this place. But when I tried to collapse my tripod, the legs wouldn't budge, like they'd been welded in position. The metal was so cold it actually hurt to touch, even through my gloves, and I could see my skin starting to stick to it like when you touch frozen metal in winter. I had to leave it there, just grabbed my camera and started walking quickly back toward the trail. The humming sound was getting louder, or maybe closer, and now it had this weird rhythm to it, almost like words but in no language I'd ever heard. The path I'd taken to get to the lake, the same path I'd walked dozens of times, looked completely different now. The trees seemed taller, closer together, and those strange marks I'd seen earlier were on almost every trunk now, glowing faintly with this pale blue phosphorescence that pulsed in sync with that horrible humming. Then I saw movement in my peripheral vision, something massive shifting between the trees to my left, keeping pace with me but staying just far enough back that I couldn't get a clear look at it. Every time I turned my head to look directly at it, there would be nothing there, just trees and shadows. But the second I'd look away, that movement would start again. It was like whatever this thing was knew exactly where my blind spots were and stayed perfectly within them. The trail split ahead of me at a fork I didn't remember, one path leading up toward what looked like a ridge, the other descending into a ravine filled with this thick yellow fog that definitely hadn't been there on my way in. Neither path looked familiar, and my phone's GPS was just showing my location as a spinning circle in the middle of a blank gray screen. I could hear branches breaking behind me now, heavy footsteps that didn't match any animal gait I knew, more like something dragging itself forward in lurching, uneven movements. I chose the path toward the ridge, running now, my camera bag slamming against my hip with each step, the weight of it throwing off my balance on the uneven ground. Behind me, that dragging sound was getting faster, and the humming had changed into something else, like multiple voices all trying to speak at once, but none of them quite human. The trees on either side of the path were wrong too. Their bark had these wet, dark patches that looked like they were bleeding this thick black substance that smelled like copper and rotting vegetation. Some of the trees had grown together at the top, forming these unnatural arches over the trail that I had to duck under, and each time I passed through one, I could swear I felt something brush against the back of my neck, like fingers but too long, too cold. My lungs were burning from the thin air and the running, but I couldn't stop, especially when I realized the path behind me was changing, literally reshaping itself, the ground rippling like water and sealing over where my footprints had been just seconds before. The ridge path suddenly ended at a sheer drop I nearly ran straight off, my boots skidding on loose gravel as I windmilled my arms to keep from falling into what looked like a 100-foot vertical cliff that absolutely should not exist on this trail. There was no way around it. The trees pressed in tight on both sides, their branches interwoven like a wall, and some of them had those glowing marks now forming complete circles that hurt to look at directly. I could hear that thing getting closer, the dragging sound maybe 30 feet behind me now, and this smell hit me like ozone and spoiled meat and something chemical I couldn't identify. I turned around finally, had to see what was following me, and through my camera that I raised instinctively I saw it. The thing was impossibly tall, maybe 12 feet but wrong in every proportion, like someone had stretched a person vertically but not horizontally, its arms hanging down past where knees should be, its head tilted at an angle that no neck should be able to support, and where its face should be was just this smooth pale surface with one vertical slit that kept opening and closing like it was tasting the air. My finger pressed the shutter button without me even thinking about it. Pure muscle memory from years of photography, and the camera flash went off even though I had it disabled. The creature recoiled from the light, making this sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe mixed with what I can only describe as backward screaming, if that makes any sense. The flash had done something to it, or maybe just surprised it, because for a few seconds it stood completely still. And in that moment I noticed other shapes moving in the trees behind it. More of these things, all different heights and proportions, but all wrong in that same fundamental way. The cliff edge was right behind me, maybe 2 feet, and I could feel loose rocks tumbling down into the darkness below. The main creature started moving again, not walking but sort of gliding forward, while its legs made walking motions that didn't match its speed, like a video where the animation is off. I kept taking pictures, the flash going off over and over, my camera making this high-pitched whining sound I'd never heard it make before. The battery indicator dropping from full to half to critical in maybe 10 seconds. Then something grabbed my ankle from below the cliff edge. Not a hand, but something that wrapped around it like a rope made of ice-cold muscle. And I fell hard onto my stomach, my camera flying from my hands and landing near the edge. I could see now that the cliff wasn't empty space but filled with this writhing mass of something organic, like enormous pale worms or tentacles all twisted together, reaching up toward me. The tall creature was almost on top of me now, bending down in a way that made my eyes water, trying to process the impossible angles of its joints, reaching those two long arms toward my face. In desperation, I grabbed my camera and held down the shutter button, the flash strobing like a machine gun, and every burst of light revealed more of those things surrounding us, dozens of them, all swaying in unison to that humming sound that was so loud now it made my teeth ache. The camera grew hot in my hands, actually burning my palms, smoke starting to rise from the battery compartment. But I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because the light was the only thing keeping them from touching me. The camera battery exploded with a sharp crack and a burst of white sparks, the heat searing my hands so badly I screamed and threw it away from me. It landed somewhere in the darkness, still sparking and making these electric popping sounds, and without the flash, everything went dark for a moment before my eyes adjusted. But the creatures, all of them, had stopped moving completely, frozen in place like someone had hit pause on a video. The humming cut off instantly, leaving this deafening silence that was somehow worse than the noise. Even that thing wrapped around my ankle had gone rigid, still holding on but not pulling anymore. I stayed perfectly still, not even breathing, terrified that any movement would start everything up again. Then I heard it, coming from somewhere far below in the ravine, my camera's auto timer beeping, that familiar 3-beep pattern before it takes a photo. Beep, beep, beep. Flash. The light erupted from below, and in that split second of illumination, I saw all those creatures turn their heads, or what passed for heads, down toward the light source, and they moved toward it like moths to a flame. That 12-foot thing included, all of them flowing down the cliff face in that horrible, boneless way. My ankle was free suddenly, and I scrambled backward, away from the edge, my burnt hands screaming in pain as I used them to push myself up. The path behind me was clear now, completely normal looking, like none of what I'd just experienced had happened. Even those glowing marks on the trees were gone, and the temperature had returned to normal. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, following the trail that now looked exactly as it should. Familiar landmarks appearing where they should be. The fork in the path gone like it never existed. I could hear my camera still going off down in the ravine, the flash firing over and over, and each time it did, that humming would start for just a second before cutting off again. The parking lot appeared through the trees, my car sitting right where I'd left it, and I've never felt such relief as when I got inside and locked the doors. I drove out of there without looking back, my hands wrapped in torn pieces of my shirt, and I didn't stop driving until I hit the first gas station an hour away where I could call my sister and tell her I was coming home early, that I'd had an accident with my equipment and burned my hands. The burns healed after a few weeks, leaving these strange scars on my palms that look almost like those marks I saw on the trees, faint lines that form patterns I try not to think about too much. I never reported the camera or tripod as lost, just bought new ones and tried to move on with my life. But yesterday, a park ranger called me saying they'd found my equipment near Mirror Lake during a routine trail inspection. The tripod was still standing exactly where I'd left it, he said, and my camera was sitting on a rock nearby, completely intact, battery full, memory card empty except for one photo. He emailed it to me while we were on the phone, and when I opened it, my whole body went cold. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, walking away from the lake on that Saturday morning, but in the background, standing in the tree line, were dozens of those tall figures all facing the camera. all perfectly in focus this time. The timestamp on the photo was from 3 hours after I'd made it back to my car, 3 hours after I'd already driven away. The ranger asked if I wanted to come pick up my gear, said it was in perfect condition. Even had all my photos from that morning still on the memory card, everything except the ones I remembered taking of those creatures. I told him to keep it, to throw it away, to burn it if he wanted, and then I hung up and deleted his email, deleted the photo, tried to pretend I'd never seen it. The Hoh rainforest changed everything for me that October, and even now, sitting in my apartment in Seattle with every door locked, I keep checking the windows whenever I hear the slightest noise outside. I'd been working as a wilderness guide for about 4 years at that point, 31 years old, and pretty confident in my abilities to handle whatever the Pacific Northwest threw at me. The Olympic National Park was basically my second home, and I'd led dozens of groups through those ancient forests without any real incidents beyond the occasional twisted ankle or mild hypothermia case. But that particular week, I wasn't guiding anyone, just doing a routine trail assessment after the heavy rains we'd been having, making sure the paths were still safe for the upcoming tourist groups. The Park Service had asked me to check on some of the more remote camping areas, especially after a few hikers had reported feeling uneasy in certain spots, though nobody could really explain why. I remember pulling into the visitor center parking lot around dawn that Monday, the whole place shrouded in that thick coastal fog that makes everything look like a watercolor painting. My plan was simple enough: hike the 18-mile loop over 2 days, check the designated camping spots, clear any fallen trees from the trail, and document any damage from the storms. I'd done this exact route maybe 15 times before, knew every moss-covered log and every creek crossing by heart. But when I signed in at the ranger station, the volunteer there, an older guy named Harold who'd been working there forever, mentioned something that made me pause. He said they'd had 3 separate reports in the past month of hikers, hearing what sounded like multiple people talking in the deep forest, always just out of sight, always moving parallel to the trail. The weird part was that when these hikers would call out or try to approach the voices, they'd suddenly stop, like someone had hit a switch. Harold laughed it off, said it was probably just the echo effects you get in dense forest, but I noticed he wasn't quite meeting my eyes when he said it. The first few hours on the trail were exactly what you'd expect. Peaceful, almost meditative, with nothing but the sound of my boots squelching through the mud and the constant drip of water from the canopy above. The Hoh is one of the few temperate rainforests in the continental United States, and being inside it feels like walking through a living cathedral, with those massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks towering 200 feet overhead. Everything is covered in this thick green moss that muffles sound and makes the whole place feel ancient and untouched. Around mile 6, I stopped at one of the backcountry sites to check the bear boxes and make sure the creek hadn't flooded the area. That's when I found the first weird thing: a brand new camping tent, one of those expensive ultralight models, set up perfectly in the designated spot but completely abandoned. The rainfly was still taut, stakes driven in at the right angles, but when I called out and then carefully unzipped the door, there was nobody inside. Just a sleeping bag laid out neatly and a backpack propped against the tent wall. The backpack had a permit tag with the name Lena McCarthy and a date from 4 days earlier, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head, because nobody leaves their gear like that in the backcountry unless something's seriously wrong. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but all I got was static, which isn't unusual in the valleys but still made me uneasy given the circumstances. Inside the pack, everything was organized perfectly. Food sorted in stuffed sacks, clothes rolled military-style, first aid kit easily accessible in the top pocket. Her phone was in there too, dead battery, along with a journal where the last entry, dated 3 days ago, just said hearing them again. Closer now, maybe 20 yards parallel to my tent, at least 3 distinct voices but can't make out words. Going to investigate in the morning. The handwriting got progressively shakier toward the end of the sentence, like she was writing in the dark, or maybe just scared. What really got to me, though, was her camping stove, still set up on a flat rock nearby with a pot of what had been instant coffee, now diluted by 3 days of rain, like she'd been in the middle of making breakfast when she just walked away. I started searching the immediate area in expanding circles, calling out Lena's name every few seconds, but the forest just swallowed my voice like it was nothing. About 15 feet from the tent, I found what made my chest tighten with genuine fear. These deep parallel grooves in the moss, maybe 3 feet apart, like something heavy had been dragged through. The moss in the hoe grows so thick that it takes real force to tear through it like that. And these marks were deep, exposing the dark soil underneath. They led away from the campsite, heading northwest, deeper into the forest where the trail doesn't go, where the trees grow so close together that even at noon it's perpetually twilight. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they just ended, not gradually fading but stopping abruptly at the base of a massive cedar tree, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist at that spot. The ground beyond was completely undisturbed, that pristine green carpet of moss without a single footprint or broken twig. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I heard it. Voices, multiple people talking in conversational tones coming from somewhere off to my left, but impossible to pinpoint exactly. The acoustic properties of the rainforest are strange, with all that moss absorbing and redirecting sound. But this was different from any echo or trick of the forest I'd experienced before. The voices seemed to move, sliding between the trees like smoke, sometimes sounding 50 feet away. Then suddenly much closer, maybe 10 feet, but I never saw anyone. The really unsettling part was that I could almost understand them, like when you hear people talking in the next room, and you can make out the rhythm and cadence of conversation, but not the actual words. I called out several times, identified myself as a wilderness guide, asked if anyone needed help, but the moment my voice left my mouth, the other voices stopped completely, leaving just the steady drip of water from the branches. The silence that followed was worse than the voices, that complete absence of sound that shouldn't exist in a forest full of life. And I realized I hadn't heard a single bird or squirrel since I'd found Lena's tent. I backed away slowly toward the campsite, keeping my eyes on the trees where I'd heard the voices, and that's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. Fresh footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. Lots of them, way more than could be explained by one lost hiker. They overlapped each other in chaotic patterns, some barefoot, others in what looked like boots, all different sizes, circling the campsite like whoever made them had been walking around and around the tent for hours. The prints were recent, maybe a few hours old at most based on how sharp the edges were, which meant whoever made them had been here this morning, possibly while I was hiking up the trail. But the really disturbing part was that all the prints stayed about 10 feet from the tent, never closer, like there was an invisible boundary they wouldn't cross. I got on my radio again, tried different channels, even tried my cell phone even though I knew there was no signal this deep in the park, but nothing worked. The responsible thing would have been to hike back immediately and report what I'd found, but I kept thinking about Lena, about the possibility that she might still be out there, injured or lost, needing help. Plus, it would take me at least 4 hours to get back to the ranger station, and by then it would be getting dark. I made the decision to secure her campsite, take photos of everything with my digital camera, and then do a broader search of the area before heading back. I started by walking a grid pattern through the forest, marking trees with orange surveyor's tape so I wouldn't get lost, calling out regularly, stopping every few minutes to listen. About 200 yards from the campsite, I found a cluster of fallen logs arranged in a rough circle, and in the center, scattered on the ground, were pieces of clothing, a rain jacket, hiking boots, wool socks, all women's sizes, all looking like they'd been carefully placed rather than dropped in panic. The jacket had Lena's name written on the tag in permanent marker, and the boots matched the size listed on her permit, but everything was completely clean, no mud, no moisture, like they'd been carefully washed and dried before being placed there. I photographed everything from multiple angles, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe she'd had some kind of breakdown, maybe there was a group of people living illegally in the park, maybe this was some kind of elaborate hoax. But none of it made sense with what I was seeing. Then I heard the voices again, much louder this time, and definitely coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding me in a rough semicircle. They were still conversational, almost casual, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, like when you slow down audio just slightly and the pitch drops, but the words stay the same. I spun around, trying to spot whoever was out there, and for just a second, I swear I saw movement between the trees, several figures walking parallel to each other, maintaining perfect spacing like they'd rehearsed it. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. That's when I decided to get the hell out of there. Forget the search, forget protocol, just get back to civilization and let the proper authorities handle whatever this was. I started back toward Lena's campsite to grab her pack as evidence, moving fast, but trying not to run because running in the rainforest is a good way to break an ankle or worse. The voices followed me, maintaining that same conversational tone, never getting louder or quieter regardless of how fast I moved, and I could hear branches snapping somewhere behind me, steady and rhythmic like footsteps, but too synchronized, like multiple people walking in perfect unison. When I reached the campsite, I grabbed Lena's backpack, shoved her journal and phone into my own pack, and started down the trail toward the parking area. But after about 50 yards, I stopped dead because there, right in the middle of the trail where I'd walked just hours before, were more of those drag marks, fresh ones. The moss still spring back at the edges, leading off the trail in the opposite direction from where I'd found the clothes. I stood there breathing hard, trying to decide whether to follow these new marks or keep heading for safety, when I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. My own voice, clear as day, calling out from somewhere deeper in the forest, saying the exact words I'd used earlier when searching for Lena. Not an echo, not distorted, but perfectly clear, like a recording being played back through high-quality speakers hidden in the trees. Then another voice joined it, also mine but from a different direction, repeating my words from when I'd first found the tent, even mimicking the slight crack in my voice when I'd said her name. More voices added to the chorus, all mine, all from different moments during my search, overlapping and creating this horrible cacophony of myself talking to myself from every direction. I'm not ashamed to admit that I ran then, full sprint down that trail, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing painfully against my spine, those voices keeping pace with me effortlessly, now mixing in what sounded like Lena's voice too, though I'd never heard her speak, just fragments of words and phrases that might have been hers from before she disappeared. I ran for maybe 2 miles before my lungs forced me to stop, doubled over on the trail, gasping for air, and that's when I realized the voices had stopped, cut off mid-word like someone had pulled the plug on a stereo system. The normal forest sounds were back, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the wind moving through the canopy. And for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was having some kind of panic attack or hallucination brought on by finding that abandoned campsite. But then I looked down at my boots and saw that they were covered in that same dark soil that had been exposed by the drag marks, even though I'd been careful to stay on the trail. I made it back to my truck just before dark, drove straight to the ranger station, and reported everything to the head ranger, who called in a full search and rescue team. They found Lena's campsite exactly as I described it, found the drag marks, even found some of the footprints, but no trace of Lena herself or the clothes I'd photographed at that circle of logs, which were somehow gone even though I had the pictures to prove they'd been there. The search went on for 2 weeks, with dogs, helicopters, even volunteer cavers checking the underground systems in the area, but Lena McCarthy was never found. and neither was any explanation for what I experienced that day. The official report lists her as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness, but I know there's more to it than that. And I think the Rangers know it too, even if they won't say it officially. I quit my job as a wilderness guide 3 weeks after the incident. Couldn't bring myself to lead people into those woods knowing what might be out there, watching, listening, copying our voices for reasons I don't want to understand. The Park Service quietly updated their protocols after that, now requiring all backcountry hikers to check in via satellite phone every 12 hours. And they've stopped issuing solo permits for that section of the trail, though they claim it's just due to increased bear activity. I still have the photos on my camera, the ones of the drag marks in Lena's clothes arranged in that circle, and sometimes I study them looking for something I missed, some clue that would make it all make sense. But the truth is, I don't think I want to know what really happened to Lena, because the only explanations that fit what I saw and heard that day are worse than not knowing at all. I've moved to Arizona now, about as far from the rainforest as I could get, and I sleep better in the desert, where you can see for miles in every direction, and voices don't hide in the trees. Oregon has always been home to me, and at 32, I'd spent most weekends exploring every trail within 100 miles of Bend. That Saturday in early September started like any other hiking day, except for the weather advisory warning about a storm system moving in from the Pacific. The forecast said it wouldn't hit until late evening, which gave me a solid 6-hour window for what should have been a 3-hour loop on the Cougar Trail. The path runs through some of the most pristine sections of the Deschutes Wilderness, winding between old-growth pines and volcanic rock formations that make you feel like you're walking through prehistoric times. I'd done this particular route maybe 15 times before, knew every switchback, every creek crossing, even had nicknames for some of the more distinctive boulders along the way. The trailhead parking area was completely empty when I pulled up around noon, which wasn't unusual for early fall when most casual hikers had already shifted to easier trails closer to town. I actually preferred it this way. Just me, my well-worn Osprey pack with the duct-taped shoulder strap, and the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from the nearest road. The air had that electric quality that comes before a big storm, making everything smell sharper, more alive. Pine resin, damp earth, that metallic tang that makes animals restless. I remember standing at the wooden trail marker, adjusting my pack straps and noticing how the birds had gone quiet. Not even the usual chatter of Steller's jays that normally followed hikers hoping for dropped trail mix. Should have paid more attention to that detail, but I was too focused on beating the weather, too confident in my ability to handle whatever the mountain might throw at me. The first mile went exactly as expected. Steady climb through Douglas firs, my breathing settling into that familiar rhythm that comes with years of conditioning. I passed the spot where lightning had split an ancient ponderosa clean in half 2 winters ago, its blackened trunk now home to woodpeckers and carpenter ants. The trail curved around a massive basalt outcropping that locals call Devil's Thumb, though it looks more like a giant fist to me. About 40 minutes in, I stopped at the creek crossing to refill my water bottle, and that's when I noticed the first weird thing. The usual muddy area where deer came down to drink was covered in fresh tracks, but they were all heading the same direction, away from the mountain, toward the lower elevations. Not just deer either. I could make out raccoon prints, what looked like coyote, even the distinctive pad marks of a black bear. All of them moving downhill, like something had spooked every animal in a 5-mile radius during the night. I actually took a photo of those tracks with my phone, thinking it would make an interesting post for my hiking group later. The image is still there in my cloud storage. Dozens of overlapping prints in the dark mud, all pointing the same direction like arrows warning me to turn around. But I kept going, telling myself it was just the approaching storm making the wildlife nervous. Another half-mile up, the trail narrowed between 2 van-sized boulders, creating this natural gateway that always made me feel like I was entering another world. Usually there were chipmunks darting across the rocks here, but today there was nothing, just the sound of wind starting to pick up in the canopy above. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees since I'd started, and I pulled on my fleece jacket, the bright orange one my sister had given me specifically so hunters wouldn't mistake me for anything else. Funny how that detail would become important later, though not in the way anyone would expect. At mile marker 2, where the trail splits between the summit route and the lower loop, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There were fresh scratches on the trees, not just on one, but on maybe 7 or 8 Douglas firs in a rough circle around the trail junction. These weren't random marks. They were deliberate, deep gouges that had torn through the bark down to the white wood underneath. Each set started about 7 feet up and raked downward in parallel lines, 4 grooves at a time. The sap was still wet, beating up like blood from fresh wounds. I've seen bear markings before. They usually scratch to mark territory or just to stretch, but these were different. Too high for a black bear standing on its hind legs, and the spacing between the claw marks was wider than my outstretched hand. Mountain lions will sometimes scratch trees, but not like this, not in a pattern that seemed almost territorial, almost like a warning. The weirdest part was how fresh everything looked. The wood chips were still scattered on the ground, some still clinging to the rough bark by threads of cambium. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at those marks and trying to make sense of them. Part of my brain was already screaming at me to turn around, but the rational side kept making excuses. Maybe it was a particularly large bear. Maybe multiple animals had marked the same trees. Maybe some idiot with a cultivator tool had come through trying to make fake cougar signs for social media. You know how your mind works over time to normalize things that don't fit? That's exactly what mine was doing. I even convinced myself to keep going by reasoning that whatever had made those marks was probably long gone, had probably made them during the night when fleeing with all the other animals. The summit route would take me higher up the mountain for another 2 miles before looping back, while the lower trail would get me back to my car, faster but through denser forest. I chose to continue up, figuring the open meadows near the summit would give me better visibility. I pulled out my phone to check the time, just after 2 in the afternoon, and noticed I only had 1 bar of signal. Took another photo of the claw marks, then sent a quick text to my roommate. Weird markings on trees at Cougar Trail Junction, probably just bears being dramatic, should be back by 5. The message showed as delivered, but looking back at my phone records later, it never actually went through. The next 30 minutes were when everything started going sideways, though I didn't realize how bad things were getting until it was almost too late. The trail got steeper, winding through sections of fallen logs from a wildfire years back, and I had to focus on my footing more than usual. But even with my eyes on the ground, I couldn't ignore this growing sensation of being watched, not just observed, actively tracked. Every instinct I'd developed over years of solo hiking was firing off like alarm bells. When you spend enough time in the wilderness, you develop a 6th sense for when you're sharing space with a predator. Your body knows before your brain catches up, the way your shoulders tense, how your hearing suddenly sharpens to pick up every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush. I started doing these casual lookbacks, pretending to admire the view while actually scanning the trail behind me. Nothing visible, but twice I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flash of tawny brown that could have been anything. A deer, a dead branch swaying, my imagination running wild. The forest had gone completely silent except for my own footsteps and breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Then I heard it, a low rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a deep purr amplified through a massive chest. The sound came from somewhere above me and to the left, maybe 30 yards into the trees. I've heard mountain lions on documentaries, even once at a wildlife sanctuary, but this was different, deeper, more resonant, almost like it was coming from something bigger than any cougar I knew existed in Oregon. My legs wanted to run, every muscle coiled and ready to sprint, but I forced myself to keep walking at the same pace. Running from a predator triggers their chase instinct. That's basic survival knowledge. Instead, I started making noise, lots of it, talking loudly to myself about absolutely nothing, commenting on the trees, the weather, rattling my water bottle against my pack. Just another hiker here. Nothing interesting, definitely not prey. That kind of desperate monologue you do when you're trying to convince yourself as much as whatever's out there. I pulled out my phone again, thinking maybe I could call for help, but the signal was completely gone. Did manage to start recording a video, holding the phone up like somehow documenting this would protect me. The footage from that attempt is shaky, mostly showing tree trunks and my orange jacket sleeve. But if you turn the volume way up, you can hear that purring sound in the background, following along as I moved up the trail. The attack happened at the switchback near the ridge, where the trail makes a sharp turn around a granite boulder the size of a small house. I came around the corner, and there it was. Not charging, not hiding, just standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet ahead. To this day, I have trouble describing exactly what I saw because my brain kept trying to categorize it as a mountain lion, but nothing about the proportions was right. This thing was massive, probably 250 pounds of pure muscle, with shoulders that came up to my chest. Its coat was the standard tawny color, but with these strange darker markings along its spine, almost like stripes that had been smudged. But it was the eyes that made everything inside me go cold. They were reflecting the afternoon light in this unnatural green-gold color, too intelligent, too focused, like it was studying me rather than just seeing prey. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then it did something I'll never forget. It smiled, or at least that's what it looked like. Its lips pulled back, showing teeth that were way too long for any cougar, and it made that purring sound again. But now I could see its throat vibrating with it. My hand was still holding my phone up, recording everything, though I wasn't conscious of it anymore. That 8-second final video everyone talks about? That was this moment, though the quality is so bad from my shaking that you can barely make out more than those glowing eyes. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second I was frozen there. The next I was crashing through the underbrush off the trail, my pack bouncing against my back, branches tearing at my jacket and face. Behind me I heard it follow, not running but moving through the forest with this horrible leisurely pace, like it knew I couldn't get away. I stumbled over a root, went down hard, and that's when I felt the first swipe across my backpack. The claws went through the fabric like paper, and I felt the straps give way. I shrugged out of it and kept running, heard it stop to investigate what I'd dropped. That probably bought me 30 seconds. My map was in that pack's side pocket, and when search and rescue found it later, it had been methodically shredded, like something with opposable thumbs had pulled it out and torn it apart piece by piece. They also found my water bottle 20 yards away, punctured by what they initially thought were knife marks until they measured the spacing. I made it another 100 yards before I realized the sounds behind me had stopped. Not gone away. Stopped, like it had just decided to let me go. I didn't stop running until I hit the lower trail, then basically fell down the last mile to the parking area. My car was still the only one in the lot when I burst out of the trees, gasping and covered in scratches from my off-trail crash. The storm was starting to roll in, dark clouds eating up the sky, and the first fat raindrops were hitting the gravel. I fumbled with my keys for what felt like forever, kept looking back at the tree line expecting to see those green-gold eyes watching me. Nothing there. But I could feel it, still up on the mountain, still aware of exactly where I was. I drove straight to the ranger station in town. Must have looked absolutely insane walking in there, wild-eyed and bleeding, trying to explain what had happened. The ranger on duty, an older guy named Frank who'd been working the Deschutes for 20 years, took one look at me and called for backup. Not because he didn't believe me, because he did. Turns out there had been 3 other reports in the past month, all from experienced hikers, all describing the same thing. Abnormally large cougar, unusual markings, intelligent behavior that didn't match any known wildlife patterns. They'd been keeping it quiet to avoid panic, but they had a whole task force working on it. Frank showed me a cast they'd made of tracks found near another encounter. The paw print was almost 8 inches across, nearly twice the size of a normal mountain lion. They closed the cougar trail the next day, officially for storm damage assessment, but it stayed closed for 3 months. During that time, 2 wildlife biologists from Oregon State University set up trail cameras all along my route and found absolutely nothing. Whatever it was had vanished, moved on, or gotten better at avoiding detection. The theory they eventually settled on was an escaped exotic pet, maybe a cougar-leopard hybrid, that someone had been keeping illegally, though that didn't explain the size or the behavioral oddities. They never found it, and the trail reopened that winter with new warning signs about aggressive wildlife and recommendations to hike in groups of 4 or more. I went back once, about a year later, with 5 other people in broad daylight. The claw marks on those trees had been cut down, removed, but you could still see the stumps where they'd chainsawed them out. Nobody talks about it officially anymore, but if you chat with the local hikers, everyone knows someone who's seen something wrong up on that mountain. I still hike, but never alone, never that trail, and never without enough gear to make myself look as big and loud as possible. Sometimes at night when it's really quiet, I can still hear that purring sound in my memory, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next solo hiker who thinks they know these woods. November of 2018 was when everything in my life seemed to finally fall into place. I'd just landed a job as a software developer at a tech startup in Bellevue after years of grinding through contract work, and my girlfriend Jamie and I were driving back from visiting her parents in Spokane for Thanksgiving weekend. The drive through Snoqualmie Pass usually took about 4 hours, but we'd left late Sunday afternoon, hoping to avoid the worst of the holiday traffic. Jamie dozed in the passenger seat while I navigated the winding mountain roads, the sunset painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and purple. We'd been together for 3 years, and I had an engagement ring hidden in my apartment back home, planning to propose on New Year's Eve. Most of my friends from college were already married with kids by then, but Jamie and I had taken our time, made sure we were ready. Life felt perfect, predictable even, in that comfortable way where you think nothing truly bad could ever touch you. The sun had just dipped below the mountain ridges when I spotted it. This old white van, maybe from the early 90s, pulled halfway off the road and partially hidden among the Douglas firs. What caught my attention wasn't just the awkward angle it was parked at, like someone had yanked the wheel hard to the right in a panic, but the way the driver's door hung wide open, interior light casting a weak yellow glow onto the pine needles below. I'd driven this past dozens of times for work and camping trips, and you learn pretty quick that leaving your vehicle like that in November, with temperatures dropping below freezing at night, meant either someone was in serious trouble or they'd abandoned it in a real hurry. Jamie stirred when I slowed down, rubbing her eyes and asking why we were stopping. I told her someone might need help, and she immediately agreed we should check. That was Jamie, always ready to help a stranger, always seeing the good in people before considering any danger. I pulled our Subaru behind the van, leaving maybe 20 feet between us, and kept the engine running with the headlights on high beam. The van's license plate was caked with mud, but I could make out that it was from Idaho, one of those old yellow and blue ones they stopped making years ago. Jamie grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight, while I walked toward the open door, calling out, "Hello? Anyone need help?" into the growing darkness. The silence that answered back wasn't normal forest quiet. You know how the woods usually have some background noise, birds settling for the night, wind through branches, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. This was different, like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The van's interior light illuminated worn gray seats and a dashboard covered in fast food wrappers and empty coffee cups. But what made me stop dead was the CB radio mounted above the rearview mirror, its red power light still glowing, and a voice crackling through the static every few seconds saying numbers in sequence. 47, 12, 91, 47, 12, 91. That's when Jamie grabbed my arm and pointed at the ground near the van's rear tires. There were shoes scattered in the dirt and pine needles. Little kids' shoes, maybe size 3 or 4, the kind with cartoon characters and light-up soles that flash when you walk. 5 or 6 pairs at least, some tossed carelessly, others lined up neat like someone had placed them there deliberately. One pink sneaker with unicorns on the side had fresh mud on the bottom, like whoever wore it had just been walking around. I reached out to touch the van's hood and jerked my hand back. The engine was still warm, couldn't have been off for more than 15 or 20 minutes. Jamie whispered that we should call 911 right away, but when she looked at her phone, she had no signal, which wasn't unusual for that stretch of the pass, but felt particularly unnerving given what we were seeing. The numbers on the CB radio kept repeating, and now I noticed something else. There were scratches on the inside of the van's back doors, deep gouges in the metal like someone had been trying to claw their way out. We should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in our car and drive away. But Jamie was already walking around the van with her phone's flashlight, documenting everything, saying we needed evidence for the police. She found more shoes leading into the tree line, creating this bizarre trail that disappeared into the darkness between the massive fir trunks. Some were placed in pairs, toes pointing toward the forest. Others were single shoes dropped at odd angles. The weirdest part was that they all looked relatively new, no wear on the soles, price tags still attached to some of them. Jamie bent down to examine a tiny blue sneaker when we heard it, footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, maybe 30 yards into the forest, slow and deliberate like someone was carefully picking their way through the trees. I called out again. "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" But the footsteps stopped immediately, like whoever it was had frozen in place the second they heard my voice. The CB radio suddenly squealed with feedback, making us both jump. And then a different voice came through, crystal clear this time. "They're looking at the shoes. Both of them. The woman has brown hair and a ponytail. The man is wearing a green jacket." Jamie went rigid beside me, her ponytail swaying as she spun around to stare at the radio. I was wearing my old Columbia jacket, forest green, the one Jamie always teased me about because it made me look like a park ranger. Whoever was on that radio could see us, was watching us right now from somewhere in the darkness. The voice continued, flat and emotionless like someone reading from a script. "Vehicle is a blue Subaru Outback. License plate starts with BX7. 2 subjects appear unarmed. No other vehicles visible on the road." My mouth went completely dry as I realized they were describing us, our car, giving some kind of report to someone else, and the level of detail meant they had to be close, maybe with binoculars or night vision gear. Jamie yanked my arm hard, pulling me back toward our car, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures standing perfectly still among the trees, maybe 40 feet from us. They were wearing what looked like hazmat suits, those white full-body ones you see in movies about disease outbreaks, but modified with dark patches on the knees and elbows. Their faces were covered with respirators and tinted goggles that reflected our headlights like animal eyes. One of them held what appeared to be a large butterfly net, except the netting was made of chain link, and the other had something that looked like a modified catch pole, the kind animal control uses, but with multiple loops at the end. They weren't moving toward us, just standing there, watching, their heads tilted at identical angles like they were waiting for instructions. Behind them, deeper in the forest, I could make out more white shapes moving between the trees, at least 4 or 5 others spread out in what seemed like a search pattern. Without warning, one of them raised their hand and made 3 quick gestures, pointing at us, then at the van, then drawing a circle in the air. The others immediately started moving, not toward us but fanning out to the sides, and I realized with absolute clarity that they were trying to surround us, cut off our escape route back to the car. Jamie was already running, and I sprinted after her, my boots slipping on the wet pine needles as we crashed through the 20 feet of space between us and the Subaru. I could hear them behind us now, not running but walking fast, their equipment jangling with each step, and that damn CB radio voice narrating everything. Subjects are returning to vehicle, moving to containment position 3. Jamie dove into the passenger seat while I fumbled with the keys, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. And through the side mirror I saw one of them pull something from their belt that looked like a small fire extinguisher, except the nozzle was shaped wrong, more like a spray paint can with a cone attached. The engine turned over on the third try and I threw it in reverse, nearly clipping the white van as I spun the wheel hard to get us back on the road. 2 of the suited figures had made it to the pavement, standing in the middle of the lane with their arms spread wide like they expected me to stop. But I swerved around them, tires screaming against the asphalt. Jamie was twisted in her seat, watching through the back window, and she gasped when one of them threw something at our car. It hit the rear windshield with a wet splat, spreading some kind of thick, clear gel that immediately started crystallizing, creating spiderweb patterns across the glass that made it impossible to see through. The speedometer hit 60 on the narrow mountain road, way too fast for those curves, but I didn't care. We needed distance between us and whatever the hell those people were doing. Jamie kept saying, "What was that? What were they doing with those kids' shoes?" Over and over, her voice getting higher with each repetition, and I didn't have answers, just this overwhelming need to get us somewhere with cell service so we could call for help. About 2 miles down the road, my phone suddenly lit up with notifications. We had signal again. Jamie immediately called 911 while I pulled into a well-lit gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras could see us. The dispatcher took our report, said units were already responding to an incident at that location, which made me wonder who else had called it in. While we waited, I noticed that gel stuff on our back window was dissolving on its own, leaving no trace except a slight warping in the glass like heat damage. The police showed up 20 minutes later, 2 state troopers who looked skeptical until they saw our faces, saw how genuinely terrified we were. They said they'd found the van exactly where we described it, but it was completely empty. No shoes, no CB radio, nothing but standard vehicle registration belonging to some guy in Boise who'd reported it stolen 3 weeks ago. No signs of anyone in hazmat suits, no unusual footprints, nothing to corroborate our story except our obvious distress and that strange damage to our rear window. The trooper taking our statement, Officer Brennan, kept asking if we'd gotten any photos or videos, but Jamie's phone had somehow corrupted all the pictures she'd taken, just black squares with error messages when you tried to open them. Brennan did mention something that made my skin prickle, though. There'd been 3 other reports in the past month about unusual activity along that stretch of road, always involving abandoned vehicles and strange sightings, but never any solid evidence. He showed us a printout from another incident report where a truck driver described seeing kids' clothing arranged in patterns near mile marker 48, right where we'd stopped. But when deputies investigated, they found nothing. The other trooper pulled Brennan aside for a private conversation, and I overheard him mention something about federal jurisdiction and waiting for the liaison, which Brennan shut down quick with a look that said not in front of the civilians. They gave us their cards, took our contact information, and strongly suggested we take Interstate 90 next time instead of the pass road, especially after dark. We drove home in silence, Jamie gripping my hand tight the whole way, both of us checking the mirrors constantly. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those children's shoes, all brand new, all sized for kids between maybe 4 and 7 years old. I did research online, spent hours going down rabbit holes about missing children in Washington and Idaho, but found nothing that matched what we'd seen. Jamie had nightmares about those figures in white suits, would wake up gasping about being chased through the forest with nets. Then, About a month later, I got a call from a blocked number, just breathing at first, then that same flat voice from the CB radio. "Stop searching. Stop talking about it. Your curiosity has been noted." They hung up before I could respond. We never drove through Snoqualmie Pass again, started taking the long way around even if it added 2 hours to our trip. Jamie and I broke up 6 months later. She couldn't handle the fear, the not knowing, the way I obsessed over finding answers. The engagement ring is still in my desk drawer, and sometimes late at night, I wonder if those kids whose shoes we found are somewhere out there, barefoot and scared, or if those shoes were all that was left of them. The not knowing is what gets you in the end. That and the certainty that somewhere out there, those people in white suits are still doing whatever it was we interrupted that night. Jason kept checking his altimeter every 10 minutes, like the numbers would somehow change if he stared at them hard enough. We were pushing through the scree field above Pumice Creek when he finally voiced what we'd both been thinking. Those clouds rolling in from the west weren't supposed to be there. The forecast had been bulletproof, 5 days of high pressure that should have given us the perfect summit window for Glacier Peak. But mountains don't care about forecasts, and by the time we reached our planned camp at 7,000 feet, the temperature had already dropped 15 degrees from what it should have been. Setting up the tent became a race against the wind that came out of nowhere, turning what should have been a 10-minute task into a wrestling match with fabric and poles. Jason actually laughed when the first gust nearly ripped the rainfly from my hands, said something about how his wife would kill him if she knew conditions were already going sideways on day one. That night changed everything. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind battering our tent, which had gotten strong enough to bow the poles inward with each gust, but something else underneath it. Like footsteps in the snow, except heavier, more deliberate. Jason was still out cold in his sleeping bag, snoring despite the chaos outside, so I just lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was just chunks of ice falling from the seracs above us. The sound circled our tent 3 times, always maintaining the same measured pace before stopping directly outside the vestibule. Then nothing. Just the wind screaming across the glacier and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might wake Jason up. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent to find the storm had arrived in full force. Visibility maybe 20 feet, snow coming sideways, our tracks from yesterday completely erased. We needed to descend immediately. That much was obvious. But Jason wanted to wait a few hours, see if the storm would break. He'd checked the satellite weather the night before and swore this system wasn't supposed to hit until Wednesday at the earliest. While we argued about it, brewing instant coffee in the vestibule and trying to keep the stove flame from getting blown out, I mentioned the sounds from the night before. Jason just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen on him before, kind of pale and uncertain. Turns out he'd been awake too, had heard the whole thing, but figured I was asleep and didn't want to freak me out. The way he described it made my skin prickle. He said it sounded like something was testing our tent, pressing against different sections of the fabric, looking for weak spots. We both tried to rationalize it, maybe a curious mountain goat or even a bear that hadn't gone into hibernation yet. Though we both knew bears didn't come up this high, and mountain goats didn't behave like that. The decision got made for us when the wind suddenly gusted hard enough to snap one of our tent poles with a crack like a gunshot. We were packed and moving within 15 minutes, roping up even though we could barely see each other through the whiteout. The descent should have been straightforward. We'd marked our route with wands on the way up, and Jason had GPS waypoints for every major feature. But the storm had transformed everything into an alien landscape. Snowdrifts had built up in places that were clear yesterday, and what looked like solid ground would suddenly give way to hidden crevasses filled with fresh powder. After 2 hours of fighting through conditions that kept getting worse, we realized we'd somehow gotten off route. The GPS showed us 500 feet east of where we should have been, in a section of glacier we hadn't explored on the way up. That's when Jason spotted the cave, Really just a bergschrund that had opened up between the glacier and the rock face, but it offered shelter from the wind that was literally knocking us off our feet. Inside the bergschrund, the silence felt wrong after hours of wind screaming in our ears. We set up the damaged tent as best we could, using ice screws and creative rigging to compensate for the broken pole, while our headlamps threw wild shadows on the blue ice walls around us. Jason kept trying to get a signal on the satellite communicator to let someone know we were okay, but off route. The device just kept searching, unable to punch through the storm and tons of ice above us. We figured we'd wait out the worst of it, maybe 12 hours, then make another push for the descent. But while we were melting snow for water, Jason grabbed my arm and pointed his headlamp toward the back of the cave. There were tracks in the frost on the ice floor. Not our boot prints, but something else, like elongated bare feet with toes that seemed too long, heading deeper into the darkness where the bergschrund narrowed into a crack. Jason tried to joke that maybe someone else had taken shelter here earlier, but his voice cracked halfway through, and we both knew those prints looked fresh, the edges still sharp and defined. Neither of us wanted to explore deeper into that cave, but we also couldn't leave. The storm outside had turned into a full Arctic blast that would kill us in hours. We decided to take shifts staying awake, keeping watch while the other tried to sleep. During my first watch, around what must have been early evening, though it was impossible to tell in the permanent twilight of the storm, I heard it again, that same measured, heavy movement from the night before. But this time it was coming from inside the cave, from that narrow crack where the tracks led. The sound would approach, slow and deliberate, until it was maybe 30 feet away, just beyond where our headlamp beams could reach. Then it would stop for 10, 15 minutes before retreating back into the darkness. Each time it came closer, lingered longer. I woke Jason after the third approach, and we both sat there, ice axes in hand, staring into that black gap while our breath clouded in the freezing air. Jason whispered that we needed to move, storm or no storm, but right as he said it, something scraped against the ice right at the edge of our light. A sound like fingernails, but much larger, dragging slowly across the frozen surface. We grabbed our packs and bolted out of that cave so fast I don't even remember putting on my crampons. The storm hit us like a physical wall, visibility down to maybe 10 feet. Wind strong enough that we had to lean into it just to stay upright. Jason took the lead on the rope, using the GPS to navigate while I followed, both of us moving way too fast for conditions that bad. Every few minutes, one of us would punch through a snow bridge or lose footing on the ice, saved only by the rope between us. But we didn't slow down, couldn't slow down, because even through the howling wind we could hear something behind us. Not footsteps exactly, more like something heavy being dragged across the ice, getting closer whenever we stopped to check the GPS or catch our breath. At one point, Jason's crampon got stuck in a crack, and while he was freeing it, I turned around with my headlamp and saw a shape in the snow maybe 20 feet back. Tall, much taller than a person should be, with proportions that looked wrong, arms too long, moving in this jerky, unnatural way like it wasn't used to walking upright. The next few hours blend together in my memory like a nightmare you can't quite recall in detail. We descended blind through the whiteout, following GPS bearings that led us through terrain we didn't recognize, rappelling off ice walls we couldn't properly assess, taking risks that would have been suicidal in any other circumstance. Jason's altimeter showed we were losing elevation fast, but nothing looked familiar. The storm had erased all our wands, covered our tracks, turned the entire mountain into a maze of false leads and dead ends. Somewhere during that descent, I think around midnight based on Jason's watch, we got separated. One moment the rope was taut between us, the next it went slack. I pulled and pulled but just got more rope, until I reached the end and found it had been cut clean through. The ends frayed like something had bitten through the core. I screamed Jason's name until my throat went raw, but the wind swallowed everything. I was alone on that glacier with whatever had been following us, in a whiteout so complete I couldn't see my own feet. Training kicked in before panic could take over completely. Find shelter, stay put, wait for the storm to break. That's what every mountaineering course teaches you. I used my ice axe to probe ahead, found a wind lip in the glacier where I could dig out a small snow cave. My fingers were going numb inside my gloves as I hollowed out just enough space to squeeze inside with my pack. The satellite communicator still showed no signal. The GPS showed my elevation at around 9,000 feet, but the coordinates meant nothing without landmarks to reference. I forced myself to eat something, melt snow for water, all the mechanical survival tasks that keep you from thinking too hard about the situation. But then I heard breathing outside my snow cave. Deep, rhythmic, definitely not wind. Something was circling my shelter, and occasionally I'd hear what sounded like sniffing, like a dog trying to catch a scent, except the sound was coming from at least 7 feet off the ground. I turned off my headlamp and sat in complete darkness, ice axe gripped so tight my forearms cramped, listening to that thing pace around my cave for what felt like hours. Dawn never really came. The storm just shifted from black to gray. The wind dropped from lethal to merely dangerous. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl out of my snow cave, the first thing I saw were tracks everywhere around my shelter. Hundreds of them, like whatever it was, had been agitated, pacing frantically. But these tracks were different from what we'd seen in the Bergeschrund. Some looked almost human, others were those same elongated prints, and some were just deep gouges in the snow like something had been walking on all fours. I started descending again, moving fast but careful, following what I hoped was the fall line that would eventually lead to tree line and safety. The visibility improved to maybe 50 feet, and that's when I found Jason's jacket. It was torn to pieces, hanging from an ice formation like a flag. The fabric shredded in parallel lines that looked deliberate, methodical. No blood, no body, just the jacket and his GPS unit lying in the snow, still showing our plotted route. I grabbed the GPS and kept moving, trying not to think about what those claw marks in the fabric meant, trying not to notice that something was still following me, staying just outside my field of vision in the swirling snow. The tree line saved my life. After 6 more hours of desperate descending, crashing through wind-loaded slopes that could have avalanched at any moment, I finally hit the first scraggly mountain hemlocks. Whatever had been following me stopped at the trees. I could feel it watching from up on the glacier, but it wouldn't come into the forest. I didn't stop moving until I reached the trail junction at Kennedy Ridge, where I collapsed next to the wilderness permit box and finally got a signal on the satellite communicator. Search and rescue found me there 8 hours later, hypothermic and babbling about Jason still being up on the mountain. They launched a massive search that went on for 5 days once the storm cleared. They found our shredded tent right where I said it would be, found the Bergeschrund with those strange tracks already half filled with new snow, found scraps of Jason's clothing scattered across a 1/4 mile of glacier. But they never found Jason. The official report blamed the separation on whiteout conditions and suggested he fell into a crevasse, his body likely buried under tons of avalanche debris. They didn't mention the tracks in their report, said the photos I'd taken were too blurry to make out anything definitive, just wind patterns in the snow. I went back to Kennedy Ridge 2 months later, on a clear day in early autumn when you could see Glacier Peak perfectly against the blue sky. Brought binoculars and spent hours scanning the glacier where everything happened. And I saw it, just once, for maybe 10 seconds before it disappeared behind a serac. That same tall, wrong-shaped figure moving across the ice in broad daylight with those jerky, unnatural movements. But here's what really haunts me. It was wearing Jason's red summit jacket, the one he always wore for photographs at the top. The thing wearing his jacket stopped and turned toward me, like it knew I was watching from 5 miles away. Then it raised one of those 2 long arms in what looked like a wave before disappearing into the ice. I haven't been back to the mountains since. I tell people it's because I lost my climbing partner, which is true enough. But the real reason is that sometimes, on cold nights when the wind picks up, I can still hear those careful, measured footsteps circling my house, and I know that one day, when the conditions are just right, It's going to come looking for the one that got away. "26 years old, and 6 months into my job with the Forest Service. The solitude of the wilderness had become exactly what I needed after my divorce. It was early June when they handed me the assignment to inspect the trail system near Ape Canyon, on the northeast side of Mount St. Helens. The area had been closed since winter due to some severe storm damage, and with hiking season ramping up, they needed someone to assess whether the trails were safe for public use again. My supervisor, a weathered guy named Bill who'd been with the service for 3 decades, pulled me aside before I left and told me the locals had been calling in complaints about strange noises coming from that area. Probably just elk or maybe some loose rocks from the spring thaw, he said, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it. The drive up took about 3 hours from the ranger station, winding through increasingly narrow roads until I reached the trailhead parking area, completely empty except for my government-issued pickup truck. The morning started normally enough. I remember because I made a point to log everything in my field notebook. Standard procedure for solo inspections. Started hiking at 7:30 sharp, temperature around 55 degrees, light cloud cover moving in from the west. The first 2 miles of trail were in decent shape. Just some typical erosion and a few downed branches I could clear myself. But as I got deeper into the canyon, following the path that runs parallel to Muddy River, things started to feel different in a way I still struggle to describe. The forest there is old growth, massive Douglas firs and hemlocks that block out most of the sunlight even on clear days. But that morning it felt especially dark, like the trees were crowding in closer than they should. About 3 miles in, I found the first real damage. A section of trail completely obliterated by what looked like a landslide, except the debris pattern made no sense. Rocks and logs scattered uphill from the trail, which goes against basic physics unless something threw them there. I radioed back to base around 9:15 to report the trail damage, and that's when I heard them for the first time. Voices, distant but unmistakably human, calling out from somewhere deeper in the canyon. They weren't hikers. The area had been closed for months and I'd seen the locked gate myself at the access road. The voices seemed to bounce off the canyon walls in this weird way that made it impossible to pinpoint their direction. But what really got to me was that they were calling my name. Not hello or help or any of the things you'd expect from someone lost or in trouble, but Caleb specifically, drawn out and repeated like they were trying to get my attention. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, radio in hand, trying to make sense of it while Bill's voice crackled through asking if I needed backup. Told him I was investigating possible unauthorized hikers and would check back in 30 minutes. Standard protocol for unexpected contact in restricted areas. The voices grew clearer as I pushed through a section of Devil's Club and salmonberry bushes that had overgrown the trail since winter. They weren't exactly louder, but more distinct, like whoever was calling had figured out the perfect frequency to cut through the forest noise. My name echoed maybe every 30 seconds, always from a different direction, sometimes sounding like it came from the canopy above, other times seeming to rise up from the ravine below, where Muddy River churned over volcanic rocks. I kept my radio on channel 3, the emergency frequency, and marked my GPS coordinates every 100 yards or so. Training kicked in even though my mind was racing through rational explanations. Maybe it was some locals playing a prank, knowing the Forest Service would send someone up here eventually. Or possibly an acoustic phenomenon caused by the canyon's unique shape combined with the river noise. But none of that explained how they knew my name, since my assignment had been decided just yesterday afternoon in a closed meeting. Around 9:45, I reached a section where the trees opened up into a small clearing, maybe 60 feet across, and that's where I saw the markings. Every single tree surrounding the clearing, and I counted 23 of them, had these deep gouges in the bark, starting about 8 feet up and extending to nearly 15 feet off the ground. The marks were fresh, sap still oozing and sticky, forming these thick amber ribbons down the trunks. They weren't random either. 4 parallel lines, each about 2 inches apart, repeated over and over like something had systematically worked its way around the perimeter. I pulled out my field camera to document them, and through the viewfinder I noticed something else. Strips of fabric caught on the higher branches, tan and olive green like Forest Service uniforms, but weathered in a way that suggested they'd been there for weeks, not months. The voices had stopped the moment I entered the clearing, replaced by this oppressive silence where even the birds had gone quiet, just the distant sound of the river far below. I need to be clear about what happened next because I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head trying to make sense of it. While photographing the marked trees, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, not an animal or person, but the trees themselves seeming to sway despite there being no wind. The motion started on the north side of the clearing and rippled clockwise, each tree bending slightly toward the center where I stood, their tops dipping maybe 10 or 15 degrees before straightening again. The whole sequence took maybe 20 seconds, and as the last tree on the eastern edge completed its bow, the voices returned. Except this time they weren't just calling my name. They were having a conversation, multiple distinct voices speaking in overlapping fragments that included my name, my employee ID number, details about my divorce that I'd never told anyone at work, and strangest of all, they were describing what I was wearing but getting it wrong. Describing a red jacket instead of my green one, boots I'd thrown away months ago, mentioning a wedding ring I no longer wore. The radio crackled to life with Bill's voice asking for my status update. It had been 28 minutes since my last check-in. When I pressed the talk button to respond, my own voice came through the speaker before I could say anything, except it was me from that morning, repeating the exact words I'd said to Bill when I'd first arrived at the trailhead. The transmission played for maybe 10 seconds, then cut to static, and when I tried again, pressing different combinations of buttons, switching channels, even removing and reinserting the battery, the same recording would play. The voices in the trees grew louder during each transmission, not in volume but in number, like more people were joining the conversation, and they started describing things that hadn't happened yet. Me falling on wet rocks, me finding something metal half buried in the trail, me running through underbrush with torn clothes. I decided to head back immediately, forget the rest of the trail inspection, just get to my truck and drive straight to the ranger station. The path back should have been straightforward. I'd been marking waypoints on my GPS the entire time, leaving small orange flags at trail junctions, following standard wilderness protocol. But when I turned around, the clearing had changed. Not dramatically, not impossibly, just wrong in subtle ways that made my chest tight with panic. The marked trees were there, but the gouges were older looking, filled with dried pitch and starting to heal over, months of growth sealing the wounds. The fabric strips in the branches were gone, and in their place hung something else. Survey ribbons, the bright pink ones we used for marking hazard areas, except these had dates written on them in black marker, all from different years going back to 1987, all with the same message. Caleb Meyer, found location. My GPS showed my exact position hadn't changed, still in the same coordinates I'd logged minutes ago, but the device's date display was cycling randomly through different years, the numbers blurring too fast to read. I ran. Not jogged, not walked quickly, but full-on sprinted through the undergrowth, crashing through salmonberry bushes and sliding on the damp earth, following what I thought was the trail back. The forest seemed to resist my movement. Branches that should have snapped bounced back with unusual force. Roots appeared where my feet were about to land, and the grade of the slope kept shifting like the mountain itself was breathing. Behind me, or maybe ahead or from both sides simultaneously, I could hear footsteps matching my pace perfectly, except they were slightly off rhythm, like an echo that arrives too early. The voices had changed too, no longer calling my name but having full conversations about me in the third person, discussing my personnel file, my work performance, my psychological evaluation from the hiring process, reading aloud notes that sounded exactly like Bill's writing style, but describing incidents I knew had never happened. Me getting lost for 3 days. Me filing reports about temporal inconsistencies. Me requesting transfers to different forests every few months. After what felt like an hour but my watch showed as only 12 minutes, I burst out onto a section of maintained trail, one with fresh gravel and new drainage channels, clearly recent work. The problem was, this trail shouldn't exist. I knew every inch of the Ape Canyon trail system from studying maps for weeks before this assignment, and this wide, professionally graded path simply wasn't on any of them. But it led downhill, toward where my truck should be, so I followed it, trying to ignore how the trail markers showed distances that made no sense, claiming I was simultaneously 2 miles and 7 miles from the trailhead. The wooden signs at intersections were all perfectly new but dated from 1980, each one listing trail conditions and warnings about recurring acoustic anomalies and temporal displacement zones, terms I'd never seen in any Forest Service documentation. My radio had gone completely dead, not even static, and when I checked my phone, which I'd kept off to preserve battery, it showed 17 missed calls from Bill, all somehow from tomorrow's date. The final stretch to the parking area was the worst part. I could see my truck through the trees exactly where I'd left it, but the forest between me and it kept stretching, adding trees that weren't there before, inserting gullies and creek beds that I had to navigate around. Other vehicles appeared and disappeared in the parking area, Forest Service trucks from different decades, personal cars I didn't recognize, once even a horse-drawn wagon that flickered in and out like a bad signal. The voices had become a roar, hundreds of them now, all discussing different versions of Caleb Meyer, Forest Ranger, some saying I'd died in 1987, others claiming I'd never been born, a few insisting I was still married, still in college, still in high school, had retired last year, was scheduled to start work next month. When I finally reached the parking area, stumbling out of the tree line covered in scratches and mud, my truck was there, but it was wrong. Same model, same color, but the license plate had digits that hurt to look at directly, like they were cycling through every possible combination simultaneously. I got in, started the engine, which sounded both perfectly normal and completely alien, and drove. The access road was the same and different. Familiar curves in unfamiliar sequences, landmarks I recognized in the wrong order or at impossible distances. The radio turned itself on, scanning through stations that were broadcasting news from various years, weather reports for dates that had passed or hadn't arrived yet, and occasionally recordings of my own voice giving trail reports I'd never made. Took either 3 hours or 30 minutes to reach the ranger station. My dashboard clock never settled on a single time. When I pulled into the parking lot, Bill was waiting outside, but when he saw me, his face went pale and he immediately called for backup on his radio, saying they'd found me, that I was back, even though from my perspective, I'd only been gone since morning. Turns out I'd been missing for 3 days. My truck found abandoned at the trailhead with all my equipment scattered around it, covered in what they described as volcanic ash from an eruption that hadn't happened. My radio broadcasting my voice on repeat, saying I could hear someone calling my name from the trees. The first time I came across that cabin was during a long day of fieldwork in the forest. I had been assigned to map out remnants of old timber roots for a conservation study, something that usually meant long hours of hiking and collecting data. It was early autumn and the air had that sharp, resinous smell of wet pine. I remember feeling a strange calm walking that deep into the forest. No cell service, no hum of traffic, only the constant chatter of birds and the crunch of moss under my boots. My partner, Drew, had gone back to the trailhead after our GPS malfunctioned, leaving me to finish one last section before dusk. That was when I noticed what looked like the edge of a roof behind a cluster of old cedar trees. The path to it was barely visible, more like a memory of a trail than something people still used. Branches hung low and wet, brushing my jacket as I pushed through. The structure appeared suddenly, half hidden under layers of moss and ivy, but still sturdy. It was a small logging cabin, maybe 12 by 16 feet, built from thick, darkened logs. What caught my eye was how clean it seemed beneath all that decay, like time had bent around it. The padlock on the door had rusted, but the hinges looked strangely new. I remember wiping the grime off the small window and feeling my heartbeat pick up when I saw what was inside. There was a lantern hanging from a beam, a steel thermos on the table, and a folded jacket draped over a chair. Everything coated in a fine layer of dust, yet untouched by animals or weather. It felt like whoever lived there had stepped out only yesterday. The air inside was thick with the smell of old tobacco and engine oil. I flipped through a stack of papers on the table and realized they were handwritten shift logs from the early 80s. The names, the notes about tree lines and equipment, all perfectly legible. I took a few photos for the report, mostly to prove it was real, because by then I already had this creeping thought that no one would believe me. I radioed Drew, but the line crackled with static. He had probably reached the truck by then, too far for the signal. I decided to mark the coordinates manually before heading back. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something odd on the wall, a fresh set of boot prints near the door, the kind you make when stepping through damp ground. They were sharper than they should have been in a place untouched for decades. For a moment, I told myself maybe they were mine, though the spacing looked too wide, too deliberate. I left the cabin feeling both curious and uneasy, as if I had interrupted something I was not meant to see. That night, back at the motel, I uploaded the photos and typed a quick summary for our supervisor. The images looked sharper on screen than they had in person. The texture of the wood grain, the dust caught mid-air in the camera flash, even a faint reflection in the window that I could not explain. It looked almost like a face, though distorted by glare. I tried not to dwell on it. Drew read through the notes and laughed, saying maybe I had stumbled on a hermit's hideout. But the site had been decommissioned 40 years ago. No one was supposed to live anywhere near there anymore. The next morning, we drove back with 2 park officers and a local historian who had worked on forest preservation records. I led them straight to the coordinates I had marked, certain we would find the cabin exactly where it stood the day before. The trail looked the same at first, the same twisted roots and patches of fern, but the clearing where the cabin had been was empty. No walls, no logs, not even splintered wood, just churned soil and a rectangle of darker earth, like the ground still remembered where it had been. One of the officers thought it might have been dismantled long ago, but that made no sense. It had been there less than 24 hours earlier. They searched for signs of dragging or tool marks, but there were none. It looked as if the structure had simply sunk or dissolved. The historian walked the perimeter quietly before saying something that made my stomach tighten. He claimed there had been stories from old loggers about a phantom shack deep in those woods, a place where workers once stayed after an accident shut down the line in the early 80s. He said they never found the last crew who logged that section, only their tools and a half-written ledger. I could tell the officers dismissed it as folklore, but I could not shake the feeling that I had stood inside that missing camp. We stayed out there for hours, circling the clearing, hoping to find even a nail or hinge. At one point, Drew found a small patch of ash beneath the soil, faintly gray and cold to the touch, as if something had burned there long ago. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like the air itself was heavier. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, only the faint whisper of wind moving through trees. When we finally decided to leave, I turned one last time to look at the clearing. For a second, I could swear I saw the outline of the cabin shimmer between the trunks, there and not there, before vanishing like mist. I did not tell anyone. Back at the ranger station, I showed the photos again, insisting that someone had to explain how an entire building could vanish overnight. One of the officers suggested I might have mistaken another site for the one we saw that morning, but the GPS coordinates matched perfectly. Drew backed me up. He had seen the cabin himself from a distance the day before. The historian asked to keep a copy of the shift logs, but when I went through my folder, they were gone. Every single photo still showed the cabin, but the papers I had collected had simply disappeared. My bag was zipped the entire time. That night, sleep did not come easily. I kept replaying the moment I stepped inside that cabin. The faint echo of dripping water, the smell of rust and wood smoke, the way the light from my headlamp had bent across the walls. Around 2 in the morning, a knock came at my motel door. Not loud, just 2 slow taps like someone waiting. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but on the floor lay a small folded piece of paper. Inside, in smudged pencil, was a single line. "You should not have taken anything." I drove back home the next morning without saying a word to Drew. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. My GPS would show coordinates deep in that same forest every time I turned it on, no matter where I was. A faint smell of oil and pine clung to my jacket even after washing it. One night I woke to find dirt on my bedroom floor, shaped like boot prints leading from the door to the corner of the room. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that maybe I had mixed up the photos, imagined the note, anything that made logical sense. But the dread stayed. It was like the forest had followed me home. I filed a final report and asked to be reassigned to a different region. The supervisor agreed without much questioning, maybe sensing I was done. Months later, out of curiosity, I checked the satellite imagery for those same coordinates. The clearing looked empty, except for a faint rectangular shadow that did not belong to the surrounding trees. Every time I zoomed in, the image flickered, like it was resisting focus. I have not gone back since. Sometimes, though, when I pass a stretch of pine on the highway, I catch that same smell, wet moss, tobacco, and something burning, and I wonder if the cabin is still out there, waiting for another visitor to find it. My name is Tessa Vaughn, and that day belonged to the kind of trip that resets your head after too many months of fluorescent lights and reheated dinners. The plan was a simple loop through hardwood forest in the Upper Peninsula, a modest challenge with a few unmarked spurs for people who like to wander. No guide, no group, just a pack, a paper map with coffee stains, and the promise of a quiet creek for lunch. Life felt crammed with small obligations back then. Answering emails from a borrowed couch, babysitting a neighbor's terrier, saving up for new boots and never buying them. The trailhead sat beside a shuttered bait shop with a hand-painted muskie on wood, its eye flaked to raw pine. A white sedan with a dented door was the only other car, windows cracked, stale mint gum wrappers on the dash. The air smelled like wet leaves and rust, like a barn after rain. Steps sank into moss and every stride hummed with that first silence you get when your phone finally gives up the last bar. 2 hours in, a weathered post appeared where the map showed nothing, just a splintered plank with the word cedar burned into it, and an arrow slanted wrong. Curiosity tugged harder than caution ever does when the sun sits high and your legs feel steady. The spur was narrow, hemmed by ferns and young poplar, and the ground underfoot changed from spongy to the rasp of old cinders. Blue bottle caps and a green plastic comb lay half-buried in duff, too recent to belong to the era of logging, too forgotten to be anyone's picnic. Birdsong thinned out, wind went quiet, the slope dipped, and my boots knocked against squared stones peeking through roots like teeth. A dark rectangle revealed itself between alders, a low structure where a building should not be, boards grayed to the color of smoke. The creek bed beside it had collapsed into a shallow scar, dry as a knuckle. The mill looked wrong in a way that does not rely on superstition. Roof ribs showed through where tin had peeled back, and a half circle of bolts ran along one wall, the arc where a saw once swung. Pine pitch still bled in glassy beads from a beam near the entrance, as if time had stopped mid-drip. A metal sign lay face down in leaves. Flipping it with my boot revealed the words Cedar Hollow Lumber in faded red, and beneath it, a smaller line that someone had scratched out with a blade. The doorway yawned wide, framed by two posts scarred waist-high like belts had rubbed there for years. Inside, dust hung in the light like fine flour, and a swallow burst from the rafters and vanished through a gap with a sound like a card flicking spokes. Every step answered with a dry whisper, nails talking to old wood. Polaroids covered the far wall, 100 small windows pinned with finishing nails, edges curled from damp. Some were sun-bleached to the color of milk. Others still held their blues and greens, faces caught mid-laugh, mid-squint, mid-sweat at a trail junction. People posed with backpacks, with dogs, with walking sticks whittled from saplings. The captions were written in different hands but always in the same place, a stripe of Sharpie across the bottom border. First names, a trail nickname, sometimes a distance or a weather note. A few showed pairs, a few showed trios. Several showed a lone person, centered as if someone else had taken the shot and then stepped back into the trees without a word. One detail snagged me harder than the rest. Every photograph wore a small notch near the top edge, as if trimmed with the same dull blade, the same length lost every time. The pattern felt deliberate, like a habit learned and never questioned. I stood there longer than I meant to, tracing faces with my eyes, half expecting one of them to blink. A gust came through a split in the siding and turned a few Polaroids sideways, making them sway like cards on a string. That sound, the faint ticking of plastic against the wall, echoed louder than it should have. My flashlight beam caught a corner where newer nails glinted silver against old wood. The photos there were crisp, colors still sharp, no sun fade at all. One showed a woman in a red jacket at a trail sign that looked familiar. It took a few seconds to realize I had passed that very sign earlier that day. The angle, the moss on the post, even the broken branch leaning behind it. It was identical. The next photo over showed a car parked by the bait shop. The same dent on the door, the same sun visor half down. My pulse thudded inside my ears, a sound so heavy it filled the space. I stepped back, trying to make sense of it, and my boot knocked something metallic. A Polaroid camera, the kind with a yellow stripe, sat on its side near a pile of splintered lumber. It had a fresh pack inside. The little counter window read 3. I lifted it out of reflex, then set it down just as quickly. Something about touching it felt wrong, like interrupting a process that was still happening. Dust motes spiraled in the light, and the faint click of the camera's shutter arm shifted on its own when the wind changed. My fingers itched to check the film, but I walked to the doorway instead, needing distance from those faces. Outside, the air felt heavier, the light dimmer, though clouds hadn't moved. A strange hush covered the forest, the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. The sedan was gone when I reached the top of the hill. The trail seemed longer on the way back. My map felt useless. Landmarks that had been obvious before, downed birch, broken post, a hollow stump, were either missing or doubled. It was like walking inside a loop that had forgotten where it began. I must have taken a wrong turn because the creek appeared again, dry and familiar, and there the mill stood exactly as before. This time, smoke trickled faintly from one of the roof gaps, thin and gray, dissolving before reaching the trees. A sound came with it, slow tapping, like nails being set, deliberate and patient. I shouted, partly to prove I was still the only living thing out there. No answer came. The tapping stopped. Then something slid down the wall inside, a shuffle of paper, a soft thump. I could not leave it alone. The doorway framed the same beam of light as before, but now only one Polaroid hung on the far wall. Just one. It glowed faintly in the dust. I stepped closer, heart punching a steady rhythm, not sure whether I wanted to see it or not. The picture was still drying. You could smell the chemical tang. It showed the doorway of the mill, empty except for a blurred figure at the edge of the frame, standing just outside the light, half turned as though walking away. The figure's backpack matched mine. My throat went dry. I remember backing out slowly, not running because running might make whatever was happening real. When I turned for the main trail again, The sound of the creak returned, steady and cold, though the bed had been dry before. By the time I reached the bait shop clearing, daylight had thinned into that gray edge where everything looks both near and far. The lot was empty. Tire tracks vanished in shallow puddles that reflected the warped Muskie sign. My car door was locked, same as before, but the back seat smelled faintly of smoke, and something white stuck to the inside of the window. Another Polaroid, taped with yellowing adhesive. It showed the mill from a distance taken through trees as if from the trail itself. The same beam of light spilled through its doorway, but now a figure stood inside, holding a camera pointed toward the trees. I drove without checking the mirror, hands gripping the wheel until the highway swallowed the forest. That night in the motel, sleep would not come. The heater rattled and coughed, and I kept checking the chair where my backpack sat, half expecting to hear the click of a shutter. The Polaroid lay on the table under a cup of coffee I did not drink. I called the local ranger office the next morning. A man answered with the kind of patience used for tourists who think they have seen ghosts. He asked for the name of the trail, then went quiet for a long stretch before telling me the mill at Cedar Hollow had been demolished more than 20 years ago after a fire. No structure standing there now, he said flatly, as if rehearsed. I thanked him, hung up and packed fast. The air outside smelled like rain again, but no clouds lingered above the trees. A few weeks later, an officer contacted me after I sent them the Polaroid. They confirmed it matched the spot where several hikers had disappeared over the last 2 decades. Every one of their cases had been filed after the mill's documented demolition. The photographs they recovered from the scene, those not ruined by moisture, showed the same pattern I had seen. The notched edges, the names, the faces half smiling into the woods. None of the missing people were ever found. The camera, they said, contained undeveloped film, but every frame came out blank, pure white. The officer's tone held a pause before ending the call, as though something still bothered him that he could not put into words. Sometimes I wake up certain I can still smell the chemical sting of fresh Polaroid film, that sharp sweetness that dries at the back of your throat. I deleted the digital copies of the pictures months ago, but one file keeps reappearing in my cloud storage, always with the same name, Cedar Hollow Joe 01. When I open it, the image loads grain by grain until it settles into view. The doorway of the mill again, faint smoke rising, and a single figure standing inside. The outline never matches my posture, but the backpack is still mine. I have changed every password I own, but it keeps coming back like the forest is not finished with me yet. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Halloween night 2022 should have been just another fun night out in downtown Denver. At 31, I'd reached that age where costume parties felt more like an obligation than excitement. But my roommate Jenna had convinced me to join her and our friend Ashley for a bar crawl. We'd spent the afternoon putting together last-minute costumes. I went as a vampire with fake blood dripping down my chin. Jenna dressed as a zombie nurse with theatrical wounds painted on her arms. And Ashley transformed herself into a witch with this elaborate green face paint that took her 2 hours to perfect. The 3 of us had been friends since college, and even though we all had regular jobs now, I worked in marketing, Jenna taught elementary school, and Ashley managed a boutique downtown. We still made time for these nights out together. That particular evening started like any other Halloween celebration, with overpriced drinks, terrible music, and grown adults stumbling around in polyester costumes. The crawl took us through 5 different bars, each one more packed than the last, and by midnight we were exhausted and ready to head home. We'd been smart enough to leave our cars at home, planning to use a rideshare. But when we stumbled out of the final bar onto Larimer Street, the wait times were showing 45 minutes minimum. Ashley kept refreshing her app, cursing at the surge pricing that had hit 3 times the normal rate, while Jenna sat on the curb trying not to smudge her zombie makeup. That's when this guy in a firefighter costume approached us, one of those realistic ones with actual heavy gear, not the cheap Party City version. He had this friendly demeanor, pointing to a black SUV parked across the street and explaining that he was actually a rideshare driver who'd been picking up fares all night between stopping at parties. His app was supposedly glitching, he said, but he could take us for cash at the regular rate if we needed a ride. Everything about him seemed legitimate. He knew the exact base fare to our neighborhood, had one of those pine tree air fresheners hanging from his mirror, and even offered us bottles of water from a cooler in his back seat. The thing that really sold us was how professional he acted, checking our destination address on his phone's GPS, confirming our names even though we hadn't given them yet, which seemed weird for maybe half a second until Jenna laughed and said her name. Then we all followed suit. He helped Ashley into the front seat because she was wearing these massive platform boots that made walking treacherous, while Jenna and I climbed into the back. The interior was spotless, with leather seats and phone chargers in every door pocket, exactly like every other rideshare I'd ever taken. He even had a playlist of popular music going, not too loud, and asked if we wanted to change the station. During the ride, he chatted casually about how busy Halloween was for drivers, mentioning specific street closures downtown that we'd noticed earlier, and complaining about drunk passengers who'd made a mess in his car the previous weekend. The water bottles he'd offered were sealed, store-bought, nothing suspicious about them at all. I remember specifically checking because my mom had drilled stranger danger into my head since childhood. What happened next exists only in fragments, like trying to piece together a dream that keeps slipping away the more you chase it. I remember Ashley laughing at something on her phone, the glow lighting up her green painted face in the darkness of the car. I remember Jenna talking about some parent at her school who'd complained about the Halloween decorations being too scary for kindergarteners. I remember the driver adjusting his rearview mirror and asking if we needed to make any stops on the way home. Then there's just nothing. Not blackness, not sleep, but a complete absence of memory. Like those hours were surgically removed from my brain. The next thing I knew, I was waking up fully clothed on my couch at 4 p.m. on Sunday, still wearing my vampire costume with the fake blood now crusty and flaking onto my cushions. My phone was dead on the coffee table, my keys were somehow in the kitchen sink, and my shoes were placed neatly by the front door even though I never ever put them there. The first thing I did was charge my phone, desperate to piece together what had happened through texts or photos, but there was nothing after midnight except for 13 missed calls from Ashley's boyfriend, Connor. My call log showed I'd apparently called Jenna at 3:47 a.m., but I had zero recollection of this, and when I tried calling her back, it went straight to voicemail. The panic really started setting in when Connor answered on the first ring, his voice frantic, asking if Ashley was with me. She'd never come home, he said, hadn't answered any of his calls or texts, and her phone was going straight to voicemail just like Jenna's. He'd already called the hospitals, even driven to her parents' house in Aurora thinking maybe she'd gone there, but nobody had seen her since she left for the bar crawl with us. My head was pounding, not like a normal hangover, but this deep, disorienting fog that made thinking feel like swimming through syrup. I told Connor I'd just woken up, that I couldn't remember anything after getting in that car, and the silence on his end stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Jenna showed up at my apartment 20 minutes later, still wearing her zombie nurse costume, mascara streaked down her face in black rivers. She had the same story, waking up in her own bed with no memory of getting there. Her apartment door unlocked even though she was obsessive about security. Her purse contents spread across her kitchen counter in a way she'd never do. Neither of us could remember anything after those first few minutes in the SUV, but both of us had woken up safely in our homes while Ashley was just gone. We spent the next 3 hours retracing our steps, calling every bar we'd visited, even walking down Larimer Street looking for that black SUV or anyone dressed as a firefighter who might have been driving for rideshares. The bars all remembered us. Hard to forget 3 women in elaborate costumes, but nobody had security footage of the street where we'd gotten picked up. One bouncer at the 3rd bar mentioned he'd seen us talking to someone in firefighter gear. Said the guy had been hanging around all night but wasn't actually going into any of the bars, just lingering on the sidewalks where people were looking for rides. Connor had already filed a missing person report by Sunday evening, and 2 detectives came to my apartment Monday morning to take our statements. Detective Garrison, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair, kept asking about the water bottles. Did we drink them? Did we see him drink one? Did we keep any of them? Of course we hadn't kept them, and neither Jenna nor I could even remember if we'd actually drunk the water or just held the bottles. The younger detective, Reeves, was more interested in the driver himself, pulling up photos on his tablet of registered rideshare drivers to see if we recognized anyone. None of them looked familiar, but then again, between the darkness and our intoxicated state, I could barely picture his face beyond a vague impression of stubble and what might have been brown eyes. They asked about the make and model of the SUV, but all I could tell them was that it was black, maybe a Chevy or GMC, definitely newer because it had that backup camera screen in the dashboard. Jenna remembered even less, just that the seats were tan or beige leather, and that there'd been an energy drink can in one of the cup holders. The breakthrough came Wednesday afternoon when Detective Garrison called to say they'd found security footage from an ATM camera 2 blocks from where we'd gotten picked up. The timestamp showed 12:23 a.m., our car pulling away from the curb with all 3 of us visible through the windows. The license plate was partially obscured by mud or something deliberately smeared on it, but they could make out that it was a Colorado plate starting with F. More importantly, they'd tracked the vehicle through various traffic cameras heading east through downtown. But then it just vanished after turning into an industrial area near the railroad tracks. No cameras covered that specific zone, and the SUV never emerged onto any of the main roads that had surveillance. They dispatched units to search the area, checking abandoned warehouses and empty lots, but it was like the vehicle had simply evaporated. Garrison mentioned something that made my chest tighten. The ATM footage showed the driver getting out briefly to help Ashley into the front seat, and he was wearing thick work gloves despite it being a warm October night. Friday morning changed everything in the worst possible way. A jogger found Ashley's phone in a drainage ditch about 8 miles outside the city limits, near an old access road that nobody used anymore except for illegal dumping. The phone was still recording. It had been recording audio since 12:31 a.m. Sunday morning, roughly 8 minutes after we'd gotten into that SUV. 67 hours of continuous audio until the battery finally died. The police wouldn't tell us everything that was on the recording, but Detective Garrison's face when she mentioned it told me more than her words ever could. She went pale when she explained that the first hour contained mostly muffled voices and car sounds, then long periods of silence broken by occasional noises they were still analyzing. What they did share was that around the 40-minute mark, you could hear Ashley's voice very clearly saying she felt sick, then asking why we weren't responding to her. After that, her voice didn't appear on the recording again, just ambient sound and what might have been footsteps on gravel much later. The audio revealed something else that made everything infinitely worse. At 1:15 a.m., you could clearly hear a garage door opening and closing. Then there were distinct sounds of movement, like furniture being shifted or heavy objects being dragged across concrete. At 2:47 a.m., there was the sound of a different vehicle starting, probably a truck based on the engine noise. The recording captured this second vehicle driving for approximately 22 minutes before stopping. Then came the worst part, the sound of a shovel hitting dirt, rhythmic and methodical for nearly an hour. The police had tech specialists enhancing the audio, trying to pick up any identifying sounds or voices during those crucial hours. They'd also used the phone's GPS data to track its movement, but whoever had it had disabled location services after the first hour, and the phone had stayed in that ditch from approximately 4 a.m. Sunday until it was found Friday. Garrison asked if we remembered anyone mentioning construction sites or property outside the city, but our minds were just blank walls where those hours should have been. Saturday brought the most terrifying revelation yet, when the tech team managed to enhance a portion of the audio from around 3:30 a.m. They isolated what sounded like a muffled conversation between two men, our firefighter and someone else. The second voice was asking about the other two, and whether they'd remember anything. The response was too garbled to make out completely, but the specialists detected the word dose and something that sounded like their apartments. That's when I realized with absolute clarity that this man had been in my home, had physically carried me inside, arranged my belongings, and left me on my couch like some kind of twisted dollhouse figure. Jenna broke down completely when we heard this, realizing he'd done the same to her, had probably stood in our bedrooms watching us unconscious, deciding what to do with us. The police immediately processed our apartments for DNA and fingerprints, but whoever this was had been meticulous. Not a single print besides ours, no DNA evidence, no fibers or hair that didn't belong to us or our regular visitors. Even the water bottles from the car were gone, likely disposed of along with any other evidence from the vehicle. The investigation intensified with the FBI getting involved due to the suspected kidnapping across state lines, based on some background noise in the audio that suggested movement into Wyoming or Nebraska. They brought in cadaver dogs to search the industrial area where the SUV had vanished, and while the dogs alerted to several spots, no body was found. Yet. Meanwhile, Connor was barely functioning, staying at his parents' house because he couldn't stand being in the apartment he'd shared with Ashley. The worst part was how calculated everything had been. This person had studied ride-share apps, knew exactly what price to quote, understood which areas had surveillance gaps, and had somehow managed to dose 3 people so precisely that 2 of us survived while 1 disappeared. He'd even known our names before we gave them, which meant he'd been watching us throughout the night, possibly heard us introduce ourselves at one of the bars, or seen our IDs when we were getting them checked. The firefighter costume wasn't random either. People inherently trust first responders, let their guard down around someone who seems like a hero. Every single detail had been orchestrated, from the legitimate-looking car setup to knowing exactly how to make Jenna and me appear like we'd just had too much to drink, ensuring nobody would immediately suspect foul play when we couldn't remember our night. The break in the case came 2 weeks later through pure luck. A construction worker renovating an old fire station 40 miles away found a firefighter costume stuffed behind a loose wall panel, along with a set of car keys and a roll of cash. The keys belonged to a black Suburban registered to a man named Gregory Hoffman, who'd been reported missing by his family 3 days before Halloween. His SUV was found a week after that, completely stripped and burned in a field near the Kansas border. But forensics still managed to pull DNA from blood traces in the trunk that matched Ashley. Gregory Hoffman's body turned up in his own basement. He'd been dead since October 28th, killed in his own home while his family thought he was away on a hunting trip. The real killer had taken his vehicle, his identity, and used both to hunt on Halloween night. Security footage from a gas station near Gregory's house showed a man filling up the Suburban on October 30th, wearing a baseball cap and keeping his face turned away from cameras, but his build matched what little we could remember. The same man appeared on traffic cameras driving toward downtown Denver on Halloween night, already wearing the firefighter costume. They never found Ashley's body, though they searched for months using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and volunteer search teams. They never caught the man who took her either. The DNA found at Gregory's house didn't match anyone in the system, and the fingerprints they lifted from Gregory's basement door were from someone who'd never been arrested or worked in any job requiring prints. Jenna moved back to Ohio to live with her family, unable to handle staying in Denver. Connor left the state entirely. Last I heard, he was somewhere in Florida trying to start over. As for me, I still live in the same apartment, though I installed 3 deadbolts and a security system that would rival a bank's. I still can't remember those missing hours, even after trying hypnotherapy and various other treatments to recover the memories. Sometimes I wonder if not remembering is actually a mercy, if my brain is protecting me from something too horrible to process. The police keep the case open, calling occasionally when they have a lead that never pans out. They did tell me one last detail from the audio. In the final hours of recording, just before the phone died, you could hear a distant train horn and what sounded like someone whistling a children's song, though they could never identify which one. Ashley's parents still call me sometimes, not blaming me, but desperately hoping I'll remember something, anything, that might help them find their daughter. All I can tell them is what I know, that she got in that car with us, and then she was gone, and 2 of us were lucky enough to wake up. Halloween night, 2018. At 16, my biggest worry was whether Brad from chemistry class noticed my new haircut. My parents owned a small bookstore downtown, and we lived in this old Victorian house at the edge of Riverside, California, where the neighborhood meets the woods. That night, my younger brother Nathan was at a sleepover, and my parents had gone to bed around 11 after handing out candy to the last trick-or-treaters. I stayed up in my room, scrolling through Instagram and texting my best friend Kayla about the party we'd missed, because my dad said it would run too late. The house was finally quiet, just the occasional creak of old wood settling and the wind rustling through the massive oak tree outside my window. Around 12:30, I heard it. This soft, rhythmic knocking coming from downstairs. Not loud or aggressive, just persistent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. At first, I thought maybe some drunk teenagers were messing around, trying to get one last scare in before Halloween officially ended. We'd had problems before with kids from the high school throwing eggs at houses or leaving creepy dolls on porches as pranks. I crept out of my room, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near my door, and made my way down the hallway. The knocking continued, steady and patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. From the landing, I could see our front door through the stairway railings, and the porch light was on, casting long shadows through the frosted glass panels. I tiptoed down to the living room and moved toward the window beside the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The blinds were closed, but I could angle them just enough to see outside without being noticed. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There was a woman sitting on our porch steps, facing away from the door. She was barefoot, which seemed strange for late October, and her shoulders were shaking like she was crying or maybe just cold. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging down her back in dark, matted strands. She wore what looked like a light blue dress or nightgown, but even from behind, I could see dark stains spreading across the fabric. The way she sat there, hunched over and rocking slightly, made her look broken somehow. She wasn't knocking anymore, she was just sitting there trembling in the yellow porch light. I must have made some noise because she started to turn her head, and I quickly stepped back from the window. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me wanted to wake up my parents, but another part kept thinking maybe she needed help. Maybe she'd been in an accident or someone had hurt her. I peered through the blinds again, this time getting a partial view of her profile. Her face was pale, almost gray under the porch light, and there were dark streaks running down her cheeks, whether from makeup, dirt, or something else I couldn't tell. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the street, quick, nervous glances like she expected someone to appear at any moment. Then she started knocking again, harder this time, and I heard her voice, hoarse and desperate, calling out something I couldn't quite make out through the door. The knocking got loud enough that I heard my parents' bedroom door open upstairs. My dad came down in his pajamas and bathrobe, squinting in the hallway light. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing me pressed against the wall near the window. I pointed toward the door and whispered about the woman outside. He frowned and moved to look through the peephole. I watched his expression change from annoyed to concerned in seconds. He turned to me and said quietly, "Go get your mother. Tell her to bring her phone." While I ran upstairs, I heard him unlocking the deadbolt. My mom was already awake, sitting up in bed, and when I told her about the woman, she grabbed her phone and followed me back down. We found my dad standing in the doorway, the chain still on, talking to someone outside. Through the gap in the door, I could hear the woman's voice clearly now, raw and frantic. Please, you have to help me. He's coming for me. I got away, but he's coming. Please let me in, please." Her words tumbled out in a rush, some of them slurred like she might be drunk or in shock. My dad was trying to calm her down, asking her what happened, who was after her, if she needed an ambulance. But she kept repeating the same things, that someone was coming, that she'd barely gotten away, that we needed to call the police right now. My mom was already dialing 911, giving our address in that controlled voice she used during emergencies. The woman outside started crying harder, these horrible, choking sobs that made my chest tight. Then suddenly she went quiet and whispered, "Oh God, I hear his car. He found me. He found me again." My dad immediately shut and locked the door, telling us to get away from the windows. The woman outside started pounding on the door, screaming now, begging us not to leave her out there. It was awful, the sound of pure terror in her voice. My mom was still on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining the situation, saying we needed officers immediately. Through all the chaos, I didn't hear any car engine, didn't see any headlights through the curtains, but the woman was hysterical, scrambling around our porch, her bare feet slapping against the wooden boards. We could hear her trying our windows, pulling at them desperately. My dad grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet and positioned himself between us and the front door. For maybe 30 seconds, everything went silent except for my mom's voice giving details to the police. Then we heard the woman shriek, not a scream of fear, but something primal and furious. And the sound of her running, those bare feet slapping down our porch steps and onto the gravel driveway. I rushed to the side window despite my dad yelling at me to stay back. In the moonlight, I saw her running toward the tree line behind our house, her pale dress or nightgown flowing behind her like a ghost. She moved fast for someone who'd seemed so injured and desperate, disappearing into the woods within seconds. The police arrived about 8 minutes later, 2 patrol cars with their lights flashing, officers with flashlights checking our porch and yard. They found blood on our steps, just drops and smears, and bare footprints in the dirt leading toward the woods. My parents explained everything while I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket my mom had brought me, trying to process what had just happened. The officers took our statements, then 2 of them went into the woods with their flashlights while the others stayed to search the area around our house. We waited in the living room for what felt like forever, drinking the coffee my mom had made to keep us alert. The officers who'd gone into the woods came back after about 40 minutes, shaking their heads. They'd followed the footprints for maybe a quarter mile before losing them near the creek that runs through the forest. No sign of the woman anywhere. They called for backup and a K-9 unit, expanding the search area. One officer stayed at our house in case she came back while the others coordinated the search. My dad kept pacing, checking the locks on all the doors and windows. None of us could understand how someone so desperate for help would suddenly run away like that, especially barefoot into the woods at night. The officer mentioned that sometimes domestic violence victims act erratically, torn between seeking help and protecting their abusers. But something about the whole situation felt wrong to me. The way she'd said someone was coming when there was no car, the way she'd switched from terrified to furious in seconds. Around 4 in the morning, we got the news. A detective came to our door, his face serious and tired. They'd found a car crashed into a ravine about 3 miles from our house, on the old service road that runs parallel to the woods. A silver sedan, completely smashed up like it had gone off the road at high speed. Inside were 2 bodies, a man in his 30s in the driver's seat, and a woman in the passenger seat. Both had been dead for hours, the detective said, probably since before midnight. The woman matched the general description of who we'd seen. Similar hair color, similar age range. But here's what made everyone go silent. Both bodies were still wearing their seatbelts, and there was no evidence anyone else had been in the car. The blood pattern showed they'd both died on impact. There was no way either of them could have walked away from that crash, let alone run to our house and pound on our door. The detective asked us more questions, had us describe every detail about the woman we'd seen. They brought a forensic team to collect the blood samples from our porch and photograph the footprints. My mom showed them the recording from our doorbell camera. We'd forgotten about it in all the chaos. The footage was grainy in the darkness, but you could see her clearly enough. A woman in a pale blue dress sitting on our steps, then standing and pounding on the door, then running toward the woods. The timestamp showed 12:47 a.m. But according to the coroner's initial assessment, the accident had happened around 11 p.m., maybe earlier. The detective kept asking if we were sure we'd only seen one woman, if maybe someone else had been hiding nearby. But we all saw the same person, heard the same voice. They continued searching for days, even brought in dogs specially trained to track injured people. Nothing. No other footprints, no torn fabric caught on branches, no blood trail in the woods beyond our property. The official investigation went on for weeks. They identified the victims, a couple from 2 towns over who'd been driving back from a Halloween party. The man had a blood alcohol level over the legal limit. The theory was he'd taken the back road to avoid the main highway and lost control on a curve. But they never found any explanation for what we experienced that night. No escaped mental patient, no missing person who matched the woman we'd seen, no identical twin sister. The blood on our porch matched the female victim from the crash, but the forensics team couldn't explain how it got there. Eventually, the case was closed as an accident with unexplained circumstances. We moved out 6 months later, not because we were scared exactly, but because none of us could walk past those porch steps without remembering her voice, her desperate knocking, the way she'd run into the darkness. I still dream about it sometimes. Wake up thinking I hear someone at the door begging to be let in. The thing about college parties is that they all blend together after a while. But that night in October at the house on Birch Avenue is burned into my memory like a scar that won't fade. I was halfway through my junior year at State University, grinding through economics courses and surviving on ramen and energy drinks like every other broke college student. My roommate Jake Sullivan and I had been inseparable since freshman orientation, one of those friendships that just clicked from day one. Jake had this incredible ability to make friends with literally anyone. He'd walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 5 new contacts and plans for the weekend. He was the guy who'd lend you his last $20 knowing you'd probably forget to pay him back, who'd drive across town at 3 in the morning to pick you up when your ride bailed, who knew exactly when you needed to hear a terrible joke to break the tension during finals week. We'd been through everything together those first 2 years. Failed exams, successful parties, that disastrous spring break road trip where his car broke down in the middle of nowhere. That particular Saturday night, we were headed to what everyone was calling the party of the semester, hosted by some seniors renting this ancient house that looked like it hadn't seen repairs since the 70s. Jake and I showed up around 10 wearing matching zombie costumes, basically just thrift store clothes we'd destroyed with scissors and covered in fake blood that kept staining everything we touched. The house was absolutely insane when we walked in. Easily 200 people crammed wall to wall. The air so thick with artificial fog and body heat that breathing felt like work. The seniors had gone all out transforming the place. Seizure-inducing strobe lights in what used to be the living room. Kitchen converted into a chaotic bar where people were mixing drinks with whatever they could find. Fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons hanging from every doorway and light fixture. But the basement was the main attraction. They'd turned it into this underground club with ultraviolet lights everywhere. The concrete walls covered in neon paint that glowed like toxic waste in the darkness. Getting down there required fighting through a mass of sweaty bodies on stairs so narrow you had to turn sideways, everyone holding drinks above their heads to avoid spilling, the temperature rising with each step down. Once you made it to the bottom, the heat hit you like walking into a sauna. The bass from the speaker so intense it felt like your bones were vibrating. Everyone packed so tight you moved as one giant organism in the darkness. Around midnight, Jake and I were down in that basement, pressed against the back wall trying to catch our breath between songs. The face paint we'd applied so carefully earlier was now running down our faces in gray streaks, making us look more like melting wax figures than zombies. Jake had been dancing with this girl dressed as a vampire for the past hour, but she disappeared upstairs with her friends, leaving him doing these exaggerated dance moves to make me laugh. The crowd around us was getting wilder by the minute. People climbing on each other's shoulders, drinks flying everywhere. Someone had started spraying glow-in-the-dark silly string from a can they'd brought. Jake leaned over and shouted something in my ear about needing air, that the heat was making him dizzy, and started pushing his way toward what he thought was an exit door in the corner. I nodded and turned back to the crowd, figuring he'd be back in 5 minutes like always. There were so many people crushed together that when someone pushed from behind, we all moved forward like dominoes, and by the time I looked back to where Jake had been heading, he'd already vanished into the mass of bodies. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and Jake still hadn't come back. At first I wasn't worried, figured he'd probably run into someone upstairs, maybe got caught up in a conversation or found his way to the bathroom line that stretched halfway down the hall. I pushed my way up the basement stairs, the temperature dropping with each step, my shirt soaked through with sweat going cold against my skin. The main floor was just as packed but definitely cooler. People sprawled on couches, couples making out in corners. Someone had started a beer pong tournament in what used to be the dining room. I checked the kitchen, the back porch where smokers had congregated, even waited outside the bathroom for 10 minutes thinking he might be sick in there. Asked a few people if they'd seen a tall guy in a zombie costume, but that description fit about 30 different people at the party. The weird thing was that Jake's phone kept going straight to voicemail, not ringing, just immediate voicemail like it was turned off or dead. That wasn't like him at all. Jake was the type who'd answer texts while showering, who kept a portable charger in his pocket because he never let his phone die. By 1 in the morning, I was starting to panic. I'd searched every room in the house twice, even pushed my way back down to the basement thinking maybe I'd missed him in the crowd. The party was still raging, but I couldn't focus on anything except finding Jake. I grabbed this guy Steve who lived down the hall from us in the dorms, explained that my roommate had disappeared, and he helped me search again. We went through the whole house systematically this time. Every bedroom, closet, even checked the backyard where people had built a bonfire in a metal trash can. Steve suggested maybe Jake had hooked up with someone and left, but that didn't make sense either. Jake would have texted me, would have sent one of his stupid emoji combinations that only he thought were funny, would have let me know he was heading out. Plus, his car was still parked exactly where we'd left it 3 blocks away. I'd run out to check, hoping maybe he'd felt sick and gone to sleep it off. The windows were fogged up from the cold, but I could see through enough to know he wasn't inside, and his spare key was still hidden in the magnetic box under the wheel well, where he always kept it. I finally found the host, this senior named Kevin Brennan, who I'd only met once before, and asked him if there were any other exits from the basement, anywhere Jake might have gone to get some air. Kevin looked at me like I was insane, his pupils dilated and clearly several drinks deep into the night. He said the basement only had one entrance, those narrow stairs everyone was using, and that the door in the corner had been locked and blocked off for months. When I insisted Jake had headed toward that corner door, Kevin got defensive, said that area was off limits, that they'd specifically piled boxes and old furniture in front of it to keep drunk people from messing around back there. But Jake had definitely walked in that direction. I could picture it clearly, him weaving through the crowd, his hand up in that half wave he always did, heading straight for that corner. Given started getting aggressive, asking why I was trying to cause problems, saying maybe my friend just left without telling me, that I needed to chill out and stop making accusations. The music was still pounding from the basement, but suddenly it felt threatening instead of exciting, like the rhythm of something terrible happening just out of sight. Steve and I went back down to the basement one more time, using our phone flashlights to cut through the UV lighting and actually see that corner clearly. The crowd had thinned out just a little, enough that we could push through to the back wall without too much resistance. There were definitely boxes stacked up in that corner, old cardboard things with water damage and torn edges, plus what looked like a broken couch standing on its end. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor, like something heavy had been dragged recently. The dust patterns didn't match either. You could see clean rectangular shapes where boxes had been sitting for a long time, but they weren't lined up with where the boxes were now. Someone had moved all this stuff recently, maybe even tonight. Steve saw it too, started pulling at one of the boxes to see what was behind them. But then Kevin appeared with two other guys, all of them bigger than us, telling us we needed to leave immediately. They weren't asking. They physically grabbed our arms and started marching us toward the stairs. Kevin saying something about calling the cops if we didn't get out of his house right now, that we were killing the vibe and freaking people out. They literally threw us out the front door, Steve stumbling and almost falling down the porch steps. I tried to explain one more time that my best friend was missing, that something was seriously wrong, but Kevin just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. His face completely changed from the friendly party host to something cold and dangerous. He said Jake had probably just found a girl and bailed, that it happened all the time at parties, and if I came back or tried to cause more trouble, he'd make sure campus security heard about it. The door slammed in our faces, the deadbolt clicking into place, and suddenly we were standing on the sidewalk in the cold October air, while the party continued inside without us. Steve wanted to leave, kept saying we should just wait until tomorrow when everyone sobered up, but I couldn't shake the image of those scrape marks on the floor. I called Jake's phone probably 50 times, sent text after text, even tried calling his mom back home but hung up before it connected because what would I even say? That he vanished at a party and the host was acting suspicious? The police would laugh at me, probably assume he was just drunk somewhere or had hooked up like everyone kept suggesting. I stayed outside that house until 4 in the morning, sitting in my car parked across the street, watching people slowly trickle out as the party died down. Every time someone emerged from the front door, my heart would race thinking it might be Jake, but it never was. Around 3:30, I saw Kevin and his roommates carrying garbage bags out to the curb, moving quickly and quietly like they didn't want to draw attention. One of the bags tore open when they tossed it, and I could see what looked like clothing spilling out, but they quickly gathered everything up and stuffed it into another bag before I could get a better look. The basement lights stayed on long after the rest of the house went dark, and I could see shadows moving past the small ground-level windows, but the glass was too grimy and painted over to make out what was happening inside. My phone battery died around dawn, and I finally drove back to campus, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Jake had felt sick and someone had taken him to the hospital. Maybe he'd had some kind of allergic reaction to something. Maybe there was a back exit I didn't know about, and he'd left without his car for some reason. Sunday morning, I filed a missing person report with campus police, even though they clearly didn't take it seriously at first. The officer kept asking if Jake had been drinking, if we'd had an argument, if he had a history of taking off without telling anyone. I gave them Kevin's name and address, explained everything about the basement and the blocked door, the suspicious behavior, how Jake's car was still there. It wasn't until I mentioned that Jake was supposed to take a midterm on Monday, that he had perfect attendance and would never miss an exam, that they finally agreed to do a welfare check at the house. I went with them, sitting in the back of the patrol car as we drove to Birch Avenue. my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. The house looked different in daylight, shabbier, smaller, with Halloween decorations hanging limp and sad from the porch railings. Kevin answered the door looking haggard and annoyed, but his expression changed quickly when he saw the uniforms. He was suddenly cooperative, concerned even, saying he'd help however he could, that he hoped Jake was okay, that these parties sometimes got out of hand and people wandered off. The police searched the main floors first while Kevin followed them around, explaining that hundreds of people had been through the house, that it would be impossible to know where everyone went. When they got to the basement, I watched Kevin's jaw tighten as they approached that corner with the stacked boxes. He quickly mentioned that area was just storage, that it had been blocked off for months because of water damage, that no one could have gone back there during the party. But one of the officers, an older woman with sharp eyes, noticed the same scrape marks I'd seen and asked Kevin to move the boxes. He protested at first, said it was dangerous back there, that the landlord had specifically told them not to let anyone pass that point, but the officers insisted. It took them about 10 minutes to clear everything away, Kevin getting more agitated with each box they moved. His roommates now gathered at the top of the stairs watching nervously. Behind all that junk was a door, just like I'd suspected, but it was different than I expected. Heavy wood reinforced with metal brackets with a padlock that looked brand new hanging from the latch. Kevin immediately said he didn't have the key, that the landlord must have locked it, that it probably just led to old heating equipment or something. The officers made him call the landlord right there, and while they waited, I noticed one of Kevin's roommates slip away upstairs, pulling out his phone as he went. The landlord arrived within 20 minutes, a nervous older man named George Hoffman who kept wiping his palms on his jeans. He fumbled with a ring of keys for what felt like forever before finding the right one, his hands trembling as he worked the padlock. The door opened to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness, way deeper than the basement level, with a smell coming up that made everyone step back, musty and metallic and wrong. The cops went down first with flashlights while we waited above, Kevin now completely silent, his face gray. I could hear them moving around down there, their voices echoing strangely, and then one of them shouted for everyone to get back, to not come any closer. The older officer came up the stairs fast, already on her radio calling for backup and crime scene techs, her face pale. She wouldn't tell me what they'd found, just kept saying to wait outside, that this was now an active investigation. But I heard her tell the dispatcher they'd discovered what appeared to be an old storm shelter that had been recently accessed, with evidence of blood and a single brown leather sneaker that matched the description of what Jake had been wearing. Within an hour, the entire street was blocked off with police tape, detectives, and forensic teams swarming the house. They arrested Kevin and his 3 roommates on the spot, putting them in separate patrol cars while they processed the scene. I sat on the curb across the street for hours, watching them carry evidence bags out of that house, each one making my hope drain a little more. Finally, a detective named Melissa Chen came over and sat beside me, her voice gentle as she explained what they'd pieced together so far. The storm shelter had been built in the 50s during the Cold War, a concrete bunker that previous tenants had used for storage until it was supposedly sealed off 5 years ago. But Kevin and his roommates had discovered it when they moved in, had been using it for something the detective wouldn't specify, something that required them to soundproof it and install a new ventilation system. They found evidence that someone had been held down there recently, signs of a struggle, blood on the concrete walls. Jake's shoe was there, along with his wallet and phone, which had been smashed to pieces. The detective said they were still searching, that there were other passages connected to the shelter that led to the city's old maintenance tunnels, that Jake might have escaped that way or been moved. The truth came out 3 days later when one of Kevin's roommates, a guy named Paul Morrison, broke down and told the police everything in exchange for a plea deal. They'd been using the storm shelter to run some kind of underground fighting ring, bringing drunk college kids down there to fight for money, while others bet on the outcomes. Jake had apparently stumbled onto their operation when he went looking for that exit door, had seen something he shouldn't have through a gap in the boxes. They'd panicked and grabbed him, dragged him down to the shelter to figure out what to do. But Jake had fought back harder than they expected. During the struggle, he'd managed to break free and run deeper into the tunnels, and they'd lost him in the maze of old maintenance passages. Search teams spent 2 weeks combing through those tunnels with dogs and thermal cameras, and finally found Jake about a mile from the house, alive but barely. He'd been wandering in complete darkness for 3 days, had fallen down a maintenance shaft and broken his leg, survived by drinking condensation off the pipes. He'd lost a frightening amount of weight and couldn't stop shaking for weeks afterward, but he was alive, and that's all that mattered to me. Kevin got 15 years for kidnapping and running an illegal gambling operation. His roommates got lesser sentences for their cooperation. The university shut down all parties at off-campus houses for the rest of the year, and that old house on Birch Avenue was condemned and demolished by spring. Jake spent a month in physical therapy learning to walk properly again, and another 3 months in counseling dealing with the trauma of being trapped underground in complete darkness. He never talks about what he saw in that shelter before he ran, just gets this distant look and changes the subject. We're still roommates, still best friends, but something shifted that night. We both learned how quickly a normal college party could turn into a nightmare, how the people serving you drinks might be hiding something monstrous right beneath your feet. Jake graduated last May and got a job at an accounting firm downtown, and I'm finishing up my senior year now. But neither of us goes to house parties anymore, and Jake still sleeps with a nightlight on, still checks every door in a room to make sure he knows where the exits are. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, rubbing that scar on his leg from where the bone broke through, and I know he's back in those tunnels, running through the darkness, trying to find his way out. Frank Dawson's Halloween displays were legendary on Cedar Ridge Drive, the kind of thing real estate agents would actually mention when showing houses in the area. Every October, he'd transform his entire front yard into something that belonged in a horror movie studio lot, not a quiet residential street in Portland. The man had mannequins so realistic that delivery drivers would refuse to walk past them after dark, preferring to leave packages at the edge of his property. His fake blood mixture had this glossy, thick consistency that never seemed to fully dry, and he'd splatter it across his driveway in patterns that looked like someone had dragged a body toward his garage. There were motion-activated screams, strobe lights hidden in the bushes, and this fog machine that would billow out thick clouds whenever someone walked by, making the whole scene look like a crime photographer's nightmare. The neighborhood had gotten used to it over the years, treating Frank's obsession like a quirky local tradition. Parents would walk their kids by during daylight hours for a safe scare. Teenagers would dare each other to touch the corpse dummy he always positioned reaching out from under his porch. And even the police had stopped responding to concerned calls from visitors who didn't know about Frank's hobby. He worked construction during the day but spent every free moment in October perfecting his setup, adding new pieces each year that he'd been crafting in his garage since January. Last year, he'd added this incredibly disturbing piece, a mannequin dressed as a jogger, sprawled across his lawn with running shoes still on, earbuds trailing from its ears, positioned like someone had attacked them mid-run. The attention to detail was unsettling. He'd even added sweat stains to the shirt and grass stains on the knees. This year, Frank started earlier than usual, hauling stuff out on October 1st instead of waiting until the second week like he normally did. I watched from my living room window as he arranged what looked like a whole crime scene across his yard. Yellow tape sectioning off areas, evidence markers next to pools of that signature fake blood, and bodies positioned at weird angles all over the grass. But something about this year's main centerpiece made me stop mid-sip of my morning coffee. Right in the middle of his lawn, illuminated by a spotlight he'd installed, was a man in a business suit, face down with one arm stretched toward the sidewalk like he'd been trying to crawl away. The suit was navy blue with subtle pinstripes, the kind you'd see at any downtown office, and there was a briefcase spilled open near the body with papers scattered around it. Frank had even added a coffee cup on its side, dark liquid staining the papers brown. The thing that really got me was how fresh everything looked. Usually, Frank's props had this theatrical quality, obviously fake even when they were well made. But this businessman dummy looked different. The suit fabric had natural wrinkles where the body was positioned. The leather shoes had scuff marks on the soles, and when the wind picked up, I swear I saw the jacket flutter in a way that seemed too natural for a stuffed mannequin. Frank spent hours adjusting the scene, moving the briefcase a few inches here, repositioning the papers there, stepping back to examine his work like an artist with a canvas. When he finally went inside that evening, I found myself staring at that suited figure for longer than I should have, trying to figure out what exactly made it so much more convincing than his previous displays. By day 3, the smell started. At first I thought maybe Frank had gone overboard with some kind of rotting food effect, trying to add another sensory element to his display. The October heat wave we were having, temperatures pushing into the mid-70s when they should have been in the 50s, wasn't helping. That sweet heavy odor would drift across my yard whenever the wind shifted, making me close my windows despite the warm weather. I saw other neighbors doing the same thing. Mrs. Kalinsky from 2 houses down actually came over to ask if I knew what Frank was using this year. That stank so bad. Her beagle wouldn't even walk past Frank's house anymore, pulling against his leash and whining whenever she tried to take him that direction. The mailman started leaving Frank's mail at the end of his driveway, instead of walking up to the door slot. Frank didn't seem to notice or care about the smell. Every evening he'd come out with a beer, sit on his porch steps, and admire his handiwork like nothing was wrong. He'd wave at anyone who passed by, that proud grin on his face, completely oblivious to how people were starting to speed walk past his property with their shirts pulled up over their noses. On October 4th, I finally went over to talk to him about it, catching him as he was adjusting some of the scattered papers around the businessman dummy. The smell hit me like a physical wall when I got within 10 feet of the display. It was that thick, cloying stench that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Nothing like the artificial Halloween scents they sold at party stores. Frank just laughed when I mentioned it, said he'd found some new decomposition spray online that was supposed to be super realistic, military-grade stuff that crime scene cleanup crews used for training. Standing that close to the businessman prop, I noticed other details that made my skin prickle. There was a wedding ring on the left hand, one of those tungsten bands that were popular a few years back, and a watch that was still ticking. I could see the second hand moving through the crystal face. The hair looked real too, not that synthetic Halloween store stuff, but actual human hair with gray streaks at the temples, individual strands moving in the breeze. When I mentioned how incredibly realistic it looked, Frank got this weird expression, almost confused, and said he hadn't added any new props this year, just rearranged his old ones better. That didn't make sense because I'd never seen this particular dummy before, and I'd been watching Frank set up his displays for 5 years straight. He brushed off my questions and went back to arranging his scene, but I noticed he kept glancing at the businessman prop with this puzzled look, like he was trying to remember where it came from. That night I couldn't sleep, partly from the smell that was somehow getting stronger, and partly from a nagging feeling in my gut. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and looked out my bedroom window at Frank's yard. The streetlight cast long shadows across his display, and I could see the businessman prop clearly from my second-floor view. Maybe it was my tired eyes playing tricks, but I swear the position looked different from earlier. The outstretched arm seemed to have moved a few inches closer to the sidewalk. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, telling myself I was being paranoid but wanting some kind of proof. The next morning, I compared the photo to what I was seeing, and sure enough, the arm had definitely shifted. When I saw Frank that afternoon getting his mail, I asked if he'd been adjusting the display during the night. He looked at me like I was crazy and said he hadn't touched anything since yesterday evening, Why would he be messing with it at 2 in the morning? October 5th was when things really went sideways. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when I heard this commotion outside. Dogs barking like crazy, car doors slamming, voices shouting. Through my window, I saw Mrs. Kalinsky's beagle had gotten loose and run straight into Frank's yard, going right for the businessman display. The dog was pawing at the figure, whimpering and barking, trying to grab something with its teeth. Mrs. Kalinsky was screaming for her dog to come back, but she wouldn't step foot on Frank's property. Frank came running out of his house yelling at the dog to get away from his display, but when he got close enough to grab the beagle's collar, he suddenly stopped dead. The color drained from his face as he stared down at what the dog had been pawing at, a wallet that had fallen out of the businessman's pocket. Frank picked it up with trembling fingers, opened it, and I could see him mouth the words, "Oh God," over and over as he looked at whatever ID was inside. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Frank's call. Not just one patrol car, but 3, then a van, then people in different uniforms who started putting up actual crime scene tape that looked exactly like Frank's fake ones. They cleared everyone back, wouldn't let anyone get close, but from my porch I could hear fragments of their radio chatter. "Missing person," they kept saying. Robert Henley, local insurance adjuster, hadn't come home from work 6 days ago. His wife had reported him missing on October 2nd, said he'd left the office like normal but never made it home. The way the cops were looking at Frank, taking pictures of his entire display, measuring distances between props, it was clear they thought he'd done something. Frank kept shaking his head, explaining over and over that he'd found all his mannequins already positioned when he started setting up on October 1st. Assumed someone had played an early Halloween prank by adding extra props to his collection in the night. He swore he thought it was just another dummy, maybe one that someone didn't want anymore and figured he'd appreciate. The coroner confirmed what the smell had been telling us all along. Robert Henley had been dead for approximately 6 days, likely killed elsewhere and deliberately placed in Frank's yard sometime during the night of September 30th. The real kicker came when detectives found security footage from the house 3 doors down that had a partial view of Frank's yard. The grainy video showed a van pulling up around 3 in the morning on October 1st, someone in dark clothes dragging something heavy across Frank's lawn, spending about 15 minutes arranging it among the Halloween decorations that Frank had left out from the previous year. The person knew exactly what they were doing, positioning the body to blend in perfectly with Frank's signature style. They'd even scattered fake evidence markers around to make it look like part of the scene. The detective told me later that whoever did it had probably been watching Frank's displays for years, knew his patterns, knew he'd start setting up on October 1st, and wouldn't look too closely at what was already there. They never did catch who did it. The van was stolen, found burned out 2 counties over a week later. Robert Henley's murder became one of those cases that goes cold after all the leads dry up. No enemies anyone knew about, no life insurance policies worth killing for, no affairs or gambling debts. Just a regular guy who sold insurance and coached Little League on weekends, whose body ended up as part of a Halloween display for 5 days before anyone realized. Frank took down all his decorations the day after the police finished processing his yard. Not just for that year, but permanently. I helped him haul boxes to the dump, watched him throw away thousands of dollars worth of props he'd collected over the years. He couldn't stand to look at any of it anymore, he said. Moved away 3 months later. Heard he went to Arizona where Halloween's not such a big deal. The new family that bought his house has no idea why nobody on our street really decorates for Halloween anymore. Why we all just leave our porch lights off and pretend we're not home when October 31st rolls around. Some things just kill the spirit of a holiday, you know. And every time I smell that particular sick sweet smell, whether it's roadkill or spoiled meat or whatever, I'm right back there, watching Frank realize that he'd been tending to a corpse for 5 days, adjusting its position, stepping around it with his morning coffee, proud of how realistic his display looked this year. Every house on Oakwood Drive had security cameras installed after the break-ins 2 summers ago, which is why what happened that night got captured from so many different angles. Living alone since my divorce, I'd gotten into a predictable rhythm. Warehouse job at the distribution center outside Madison, Wisconsin. Late shifts that ended at midnight. Same route home 5 nights a week. 32 isn't old, but it's old enough to appreciate a quiet routine, especially after the chaos of a messy split. That Halloween fell on a Tuesday in 2017, and the guys at work had decorated the loading dock with those cheap plastic skeletons that glow in the dark. We shared fun-size candy bars during our breaks, complained about the new scanning system that kept freezing up, and made the usual jokes about being stuck at work while kids were out collecting candy by the pillowcase full. Normal night, normal conversations, normal everything right up until I clocked out at 12:03 and headed to my car in the employee parking lot. Madison gets quiet after midnight, but that drive home felt like traveling through a ghost town. And I don't mean that in the Halloween decoration sense. The university district usually has at least a few drunk students wandering around, especially on Halloween, but the streets were completely empty. Not just empty, but wrong somehow. Like everyone had gotten some memo I'd missed about staying indoors. The 20-minute drive felt longer with no other cars on the road. Just me and my headlights cutting through patches of fog that had rolled in from the lakes. Every house I passed still had porch lights burning bright, those universal Halloween signals that candy was available, except it was way too late for any kid to still be out. The McDonald's on Miller Road sat dark. The gas station that never closes had its pumps shut off. Even the police car that usually sits at the speed trap near the industrial park was nowhere to be seen. By the time I turned onto my street, my brain was trying to rationalize it all. Maybe there was some big event downtown I hadn't heard about. Maybe the weather forecast had warned about storms. Maybe I was just tired and overthinking everything. My driveway is one of those long gravel types that curves slightly, about 40 feet from the street to my garage, lined with these overgrown juniper bushes the previous owner planted in the 90s. As my headlights swept across the gravel, illuminating the path ahead, 2 figures came into view at the very end of my driveway, right where it meets the sidewalk. They were just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. Both wore those vintage clown masks, not the cheap plastic ones from party stores, but those old-school rubber ones with the wild orange hair, huge red noses, and painted smiles that stretched way too wide. One was notably taller, maybe 6'3", wearing what looked like a mechanic's coveralls splattered with dark stains. The shorter one, probably 5'8" or 5'9", had on a faded yellow raincoat despite the fact it hadn't rained in weeks. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing there like mannequins somebody had placed at the end of my driveway as the world's worst Halloween prank. My first thought was college kids being idiots, because Madison is full of them and Halloween brings out their worst judgment. I actually laughed a little, reaching for my phone to maybe snap a picture for my buddies at work. Check out these morons trying to scare me. But as I got closer, my headlights lit them up better, and that's when I noticed what the taller one was holding. Down by his side, gripped in his right hand like it weighed nothing, was a sledgehammer. Not a prop, not some foam Halloween decoration, but an actual sledgehammer with a worn wooden handle and a head that had seen some serious use. The shorter one's hands were empty, but stayed weirdly positioned at stomach level, fingers spread wide like they were pressing against invisible glass. Neither of them reacted to my car approaching, didn't shield their eyes from the headlights, didn't shift their weight or adjust their stance. They just kept staring through those mask eye holes, and even from inside my car I could see their actual eyes behind the rubber, wide open, unblinking, focused directly on me. I stopped my car about 15 feet from them, engine running, doors locked without even thinking about it. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was just an elaborate prank, but my gut was screaming something completely different. These weren't drunk college kids trying to get a reaction. There was something methodical about how they stood, something practiced and deliberate. I hit my high beams, flooding them with even more light. And still nothing. No flinch, no movement, just that horrible stillness. That's when I noticed other details that made my mouth go dry. The taller one's coveralls had fresh mud on the knees, like he'd been kneeling in dirt recently. The sledgehammer had something dark and wet on its head that definitely wasn't rust. The shorter one's raincoat had tears along the bottom, 3 parallel rips like something had clawed at it. My hand fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it as I tried to dial 911 while keeping my eyes on them. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. A woman's voice, calm and professional, asking about my emergency. "There are 2 people in clown masks blocking my driveway," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "One of them has a sledgehammer. They're just standing there, not moving, and I'm trapped in my car." The dispatcher asked for my address, which I rattled off quickly, then asked if I was in immediate danger. Before I could answer, both clowns tilted their heads to the left at exactly the same moment, like synchronized swimmers performing some twisted routine. The movement was so sudden and coordinated that I actually jumped in my seat, my knee hitting the steering wheel. "They're moving," I said into the phone, hearing my voice crack this time. "Please send someone now." The dispatcher told me units were on the way, stay in the vehicle, keep the doors locked, and stay on the line. She asked me to describe what they were doing, but I could barely process it myself. The taller one had started tapping the sledgehammer against his palm, slow, rhythmic taps that I could actually hear through my closed windows. The shorter one began doing this weird swaying motion, shifting weight from foot to foot like a boxer warming up, those spread fingers finally curling into fists. Then they started walking toward my car. Not running, not rushing, just walking with these measured, deliberate steps that somehow felt more threatening than if they'd charged at me. The dispatcher kept asking what was happening, and I kept narrating like some twisted play-by-play announcer, but my voice was getting higher, tighter. "They're coming closer, maybe 10 feet away now. The tall one is raising the hammer." That's when I threw the car in reverse, tires spinning on the gravel, backing up fast toward the street. But here's the thing about my driveway. It curves, and backing up at night when you're panicking isn't exactly precision driving. I clipped one of those juniper bushes, felt the car lurch, overcorrected, and ended up with my back wheels in the grass of my front yard. The engine stalled. In that sudden silence, I could hear them crunching across the gravel, getting closer, and the dispatcher saying something about units being 3 minutes out. But 3 minutes felt like 3 hours when those masks were reflecting in my mirrors. I got the engine started again just as the sledgehammer came down on my hood. The sound was incredible. This metallic crash that made my ears ring left a dent the size of a dinner plate right in front of me. The shorter one pressed both palms flat against my driver's side window, and I could see every detail of those hands through the glass. Dirt under the fingernails, scratches across the knuckles, a gold wedding band on the left ring finger that somehow made everything worse because it made them human, real, not just Halloween decorations come to life. They started dragging their hands down the window, leaving these greasy smears, and that's when I heard it, laughing. Not maniacal movie villain laughing, but this low, satisfied chuckle coming from behind both masks. I gunned it backward again, heard them stumble away from the car, managed to get onto the street properly this time. The dispatcher was asking if I was okay, if I could drive to the police station, but I wasn't leaving my property to these psychos. I pulled across the street into Harold's driveway, the neighbor with all the decorations, and kept my headlights pointed at my house, engine running, ready to bolt if they came after me. From Harold's driveway, I watched them through my windshield, the dispatcher still on speakerphone asking for updates every few seconds. The 2 clowns stood in my yard for a moment, looking at each other like they were having some silent conversation. Then the shorter one walked over to my mailbox, this sturdy metal thing my ex-wife insisted we needed, and the taller one followed. Without any hesitation, the tall one swung that sledgehammer in a perfect arc and demolished the mailbox post in 2 hits. The whole thing toppled over into the street with this hollow clang that echoed through the neighborhood, but nobody came out to look. Not Harold, whose house I was parked in front of. Not the Andersons next door with their new baby who usually woke up at every little noise. Not even Doug from 2 houses over who worked security and always kept watch on the street. Every house stayed dark and quiet except for those porch lights, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The clowns started walking down the street, not hurrying, that same measured pace, and they stopped at the Andersons' driveway. What happened next still makes me sick to think about. The shorter one produced something from that yellow raincoat, a screwdriver maybe 8 inches long, and went straight for the Andersons' minivan tires. 4 quick, efficient punctures, 1 for each tire, the hissing sound carrying all the way to where I sat. The taller one took the sledgehammer to their garden gnomes, these silly things Jennifer Anderson had collected for years, pulverizing each one into ceramic dust with single swings. They moved to Doug's house next, and I watched the tall one cave in the windshield of his pickup truck, while the shorter one did something to his porch I couldn't quite see. The dispatcher kept saying units were almost there, 1 minute out, but these 2 were working their way down the street like they had all the time in the world. Every few houses they'd stop, look back at me still sitting in Harold's driveway with my lights on, and do that synchronized head tilt again. They wanted me to watch. This whole thing, whatever it was, they wanted me to see it all. The worst part was how quiet they were. No whooping or yelling or typical vandalism noise, just the sounds of destruction and those occasional low chuckles that drifted across the night air. Finally, I saw the blue and red lights coming down the street. 2 squad cars, no sirens, but lights flashing, moving fast. The clowns saw them too. They were standing in front of the Thompsons' house about 6 houses down from mine. And when those lights appeared, they just stopped. Didn't run, didn't panic, just stood there facing the approaching police cars. The cops pulled up, blocking them in, officers getting out with hands on their weapons, shouting commands I couldn't quite hear from where I sat. The 2 clowns raised their hands slowly, the tall one still holding that sledgehammer until an officer yelled at him to drop it. It fell to the pavement with a clang that seemed to break whatever spell had been hanging over the neighborhood. Suddenly, porch lights were flicking on. People were coming out of their houses in robes and pajamas, everyone talking at once. Harold came running out to his driveway where I was still parked, asking what the hell was going on, why I was there, what happened to my car. I couldn't even answer him properly, just pointed at the cops putting handcuffs on the 2 figures who were still wearing those horrible masks. The police took my statement that night, then again the next morning at the station. The 2 men in the clown masks were brothers from Beloit, about 40 minutes away, Tommy and Carl Bradshaw, ages 26 and 29. They'd driven up to Madison with a trunk full of tools and no explanation that made any sense. When the cops asked them why they did it, why they picked my street, why they stood at my driveway first, they wouldn't say a word. Just sat there in interrogation, no lawyers, no demands, completely silent. The detective told me they found my address written on a piece of paper in their car, along with 3 other addresses in different Wisconsin towns, but no connection between any of us. No mutual friends, no shared workplaces, nothing. They both pled guilty to vandalism, property destruction, and menacing. Got 18 months each, served 8. I never found out why they came to Oakwood Drive that night, why they waited at my driveway, why they wanted me specifically to watch what they did. The security footage from all those houses, including mine, showed them arriving at exactly 11:47, standing at the end of my driveway for 13 minutes before I got home, never moving, never checking phones, just waiting. Sometimes I still dream about those masks, those synchronized head tilts, that wedding ring catching the light. I moved out of that house 3 months later, got an apartment closer to work, one with a parking garage and a doorman. But every Halloween, when I see kids in clown costumes or those decorative masks in store windows, I remember that night and wonder if Tommy and Carl Bradshaw are out there somewhere, maybe wearing different masks this time, standing at the end of someone else's driveway. The last kid showed up at my door dressed as some character from a video game I didn't recognize, and I dumped the rest of my candy bars into his pillowcase just to be done with it. My feet were killing me from standing at the door for 3 hours straight, and the inflatable dinosaur costume I'd been wearing was making me sweat like crazy. After locking up and turning off the porch light, I collapsed on the couch and pulled out my phone to order food. The fridge had nothing but expired yogurt and beer, and Antonio's was the only pizza place still delivering this late on Halloween. Their app was acting weird, taking forever to load, but eventually my order went through. Large pepperoni, garlic knots, and a 2-liter of Coke. 45 minutes, the confirmation said. I peeled off that ridiculous dinosaur suit and grabbed a shower while I waited, figuring I had plenty of time. The doorbell rang right as I was pulling a shirt over my head, still damp from the shower. Through the peephole, I could make out a tall figure in a cracked skull mask holding what looked like a pizza bag. Nothing unusual for Halloween night. I'd seen 3 delivery drivers earlier wearing costumes while I was handing out candy. But when I opened the door, the guy just stood there, completely silent, his head cocked at this weird angle like he was examining me through those hollow eye sockets. The pizza bag in his hands was plain black. No logo or anything. Not the red insulated ones with Antonio's name that I'd seen dozens of times before. He was wearing a faded leather jacket over a black hoodie, and I noticed his jeans had dark stains on them, maybe grease or mud. After what felt like way too long, he finally spoke in this rough whisper that barely sounded human, saying $24.50 for the order. I handed him $30 and told him to keep the change, just wanting this interaction to end. But instead of leaving right away, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out this crumpled receipt, smoothing it against his thigh before handing it to me. His fingers were covered in these thick work gloves, the kind mechanics wear, with something dark caked under the fingernails. The receipt was just a plain white slip with my order typed out in basic computer font. No Antonio's header, no phone number, no address, nothing. When I looked up to ask about it, he was already walking away, but not toward any car I could see in my driveway. There was this beat-up gray sedan parked across the street that I'd never seen before. No delivery sign on top, no company stickers anywhere. He climbed in and just sat there for a minute with the engine off, and I could swear he was still watching my house through that cracked skull mask. The pizza tasted fine, maybe a little cold, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling while I ate. About 20 minutes later, I heard something outside. Not loud, just this subtle scraping sound like someone dragging something across concrete. My backyard motion light clicked on, flooding the patio with harsh white light. But from the kitchen window, I couldn't see anything out there. Then it clicked off after 30 seconds, the way it's supposed to, leaving everything dark again. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and went to check the back door, making sure it was locked. And that's when I noticed the doorknob was wet, like someone had just tried turning it with damp hands. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, from the side of the house where I keep the trash cans. My neighbor's dog started going absolutely crazy, barking and snarling in a way I'd never heard from that usually friendly golden retriever. I killed all the lights in my house and moved to the living room window, peeking through the blinds at the street. That gray sedan was gone, but I could see fresh tire marks in the wet leaves where it had been parked. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I kept the flashlight gripped tight in my sweaty palm. Then I saw him, or at least I think it was him, standing at the far edge of my property line, just barely visible under the streetlight. Same height, same leather jacket, but the skull mask was gone, replaced by what looked like a plain black ski mask. He was holding something in his right hand, maybe a crowbar or a tire iron, just standing there perfectly still like he was waiting for something. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my screen was frozen on the Antonio's app, showing my order as still pending, like I'd never received anything at all. The sound of breaking glass from my basement window sent me into full panic mode. I could hear footsteps down there, slow and deliberate, testing each stair to avoid the creaky spots like someone who'd been listening and learning. My phone finally unfroze, and I managed to dial 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher while barricading myself in the upstairs bathroom. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs to the main floor, and I heard him trying the basement door that led to my kitchen. Thank God I'd installed that deadbolt last summer. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, that units were on the way, but all I could focus on was the sound of metal scraping against metal as he worked on that lock. Then suddenly, complete silence. No footsteps, no scraping, nothing. Just me breathing hard in that tiny bathroom, sitting in the bathtub with a baseball bat I'd grabbed from my bedroom. The police siren started wailing in the distance, getting louder by the second, and I heard rapid footsteps running through my basement toward the broken window. By the time the cops got there, maybe 3 minutes later, he was long gone, leaving only muddy boot prints across my basement floor and scratches all over the deadbolt. The officers swept through my house with their guns drawn while I waited outside with a blanket around my shoulders, feeling like I was in some crime show. One of them, Officer Daniels, came out holding an evidence bag with that crumpled receipt I'd left on my kitchen counter. He asked me to confirm the name of the pizza place, and when I told him Antonio's, he got this concerned look on his face. Turns out, they'd called the restaurant. Antonio's had no record of my order, no driver working that night matching my description, and their last delivery had gone out at 9:15, over an hour before my pizza arrived. They found more evidence over the next hour that made everything worse. My security camera, which I'd honestly forgotten was even working, had captured the whole thing in grainy black and white footage. The guy had been circling my house for at least 30 minutes before ringing the doorbell, trying every window, checking every door, even lifting up my garage door a few inches to peer inside. At one point in the footage, he stood directly under the camera and looked up, that skull mask filling the entire frame, like he wanted me to know he knew it was there. The investigators found something else too, a receipt from a hardware store time-stamped from that afternoon, blown against my fence for items including work gloves, a crowbar, and zip ties. The cop showing me the footage pointed out something I hadn't noticed. In several frames, you could see another person sitting in that gray sedan. Just a shadow, really, but definitely someone else involved in whatever this was supposed to be. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Rivera with tired eyes and coffee stains on her blazer, sat me down and explained what they thought had happened. These guys had been hitting houses all through October, using food delivery as a cover to scope out potential targets. They'd watch for people living alone, figure out their routines, then come back later for a home invasion. The Halloween angle was new though. With everyone wearing masks and costumes, nobody would think twice about a delivery driver in a skull mask. She showed me reports from 3 other neighborhoods where similar things had happened, though I was the only one where they'd actually tried to break in that same night. The pizza was real, she explained, probably from some cheap place across town, just to make the interaction seem legitimate enough that victims wouldn't immediately call the cops. What really got to me was when she mentioned they'd found similar boot prints at another house 2 streets over, where an elderly man had ordered Chinese food around 8 that same night. Officer Daniels came back with more questions and a laptop showing mugshots, asking if any of the faces looked familiar. But how could I tell when the guy never took off his mask? They had me walk through everything 3 more times, and each telling made me remember new details. The way he'd tilted his head when studying my house, how his breathing sounded labored through the mask, the chemical smell coming off his clothes like motor oil mixed with something else. Around 2 in the morning, after they'd photographed everything and taken the receipt as evidence, Rivera told me they'd be increasing patrols in the area, but suggested I might want to stay somewhere else for a few nights. My sister lived 40 minutes away in Terre Haute, and I called her from the police station parking lot. my voice shaking as I tried to explain why I needed to crash at her place without completely freaking her out about what had just happened. I stayed at my sister's place for a week, barely sleeping, jumping at every doorbell and delivery truck that passed by. When I finally went back home, I installed a new security system with cameras covering every angle, motion sensors that could detect a mouse, and one of those video doorbells that lets you see who's there from your phone. The police never caught those guys, at least not that they told me about, but the break-in stopped after Halloween, just vanished like they'd never happened. Rivera called me 2 weeks later to say they'd found the gray sedan abandoned in a parking garage downtown, completely cleaned out except for a stack of fake receipts from various restaurants and a box of those cheap skull masks you can buy at any costume shop. The worst part was finding out from my neighbor months later that he'd seen someone in his backyard that same night, trying his shed door, but figured it was just drunk teenagers playing Halloween pranks and didn't call anyone about it. Even now, years later, I don't order delivery to my house anymore. I always pick it up myself or meet drivers at the gas station down the street where there are lights and cameras everywhere. Every Halloween when the doorbell rings, even when I can see it's clearly just kids in superhero costumes, my chest gets tight and I have to take a deep breath before opening the door. The detective was probably right about it being some organized crew that moved on to another city, but sometimes I wonder if that guy in the skull mask drives past my house occasionally, remembering the one that got away, maybe waiting for me to let my guard down and order another pizza on some random night. I keep that baseball bat next to my bed now, and I've gotten really good at recognizing the sound of every normal creak and settling noise my house makes, so I'll know immediately if something's actually wrong. The funny thing is, I found out later that Antonio's had actually closed at 9 that night due to their oven breaking down, which means whoever brought me that pizza had gone through the trouble of getting one from somewhere else, just to make their twisted plan work. It was one of those chilly late October evenings when the air smelled like wet leaves and pumpkin candles. My parents were both working the night shift that Halloween, so it was just me and my little brother Caleb. He was 8, dressed as a vampire with fake fangs that kept falling out, while I wore a cheap witch hat and an oversized sweater. Our neighborhood wasn't fancy, but people went all out with decorations, fake cobwebs in bushes, orange lights hanging from porches, and skeletons swaying from trees. It felt safe, familiar. I'd walked those streets my whole life, and I thought I knew everyone who lived there. We started around 6 when the sky was still a faded purple, and kids were running from door to door with plastic pumpkins. I remember how Caleb kept tugging on my sleeve, pointing at every house that had a fog machine or a motion-activated ghost. Everything felt normal, until I noticed the white van parked across from the Hendersons' house. No decorations, no logo, just plain white. The windows were tinted darker than usual, and I could barely make out if someone was inside. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor's friend, maybe someone visiting for the holiday. But about 20 minutes later, when we turned onto Willowbrook Lane, there it was again. Same white van, same spot near the corner. I laughed nervously and said something to Caleb about how funny it was that the same car kept following our route, but he didn't even look up. He was too busy counting his candy. I tried not to think about it, but my mind started piecing things together. The van hadn't passed us yet. Somehow it always ended up one street ahead. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe there were 2 vans that looked alike. By the time we reached the last few houses, most of the little kids had gone home, and the streets were quieter. Porch lights flickered on and off as people ran out of candy. That's when I saw the van again, parked halfway down Birchwood Court, its headlights off. It was angled slightly toward us, like it had stopped mid-turn. I held Caleb's hand tighter and said we were heading home. He groaned, saying he still wanted to hit just one more house, but I didn't answer. Something about that van, the stillness of it, the way it seemed to wait, made the back of my neck sting with cold air. When we reached our house, the porch light was still on, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Caleb ran ahead, already planning to dump his candy on the living room floor. I glanced back one last time before stepping inside, and the van rolled slowly past the corner, its headlights off again. It didn't stop, didn't speed up, just drifted by like it was scanning the neighborhood. I stood there until it disappeared behind the trees, pretending to check my phone so Caleb wouldn't see I was nervous. Dad came home not long after. He's the kind of person who keeps everything organized, from our bills to the neighborhood watch schedule. I told him about the van right away, expecting him to brush it off, but instead he frowned and went straight to his laptop. Our neighborhood has a shared camera system. Every few houses, someone has a motion-activated feed connected to a shared network. Dad started pulling up footage from earlier that evening, clicking through the timestamps as I stood beside him. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. We saw the van the first time, parked near the Hendersons. Then again on Willowbrook Lane, again on Birchwood Court. Each time it stopped for several minutes, lights off, before moving to the next street. Dad zoomed in on the license plate, but it was too blurry to read. He replayed one clip in slow motion, and we both saw a shadow inside the driver's seat. Someone tall, wearing what looked like a baseball cap. No movement, just sitting there waiting. Dad called the non-emergency police line, gave them the footage, and they said they'd send someone to check it out. While he was on the phone, I went to Caleb's room to tell him everything was fine, but when I looked out his window, I saw the van again, parked 3 houses down. This time, the headlights were on, faintly glowing against the pavement. The figure inside wasn't moving, but I could tell whoever it was facing our house. I shut the blinds without saying a word. The police arrived about half an hour later, 2 officers in uniform who walked the street with flashlights. By then, the van was gone. They took Dad's statement, copied the footage onto a USB drive, and told us they'd file a report. One of them said something about how Halloween nights always attract weird traffic, but I could tell from the look they exchanged that they took it seriously. They left their card and promised to follow up. That night, I barely slept. Every time a car passed, the sound of tires on wet asphalt made me sit up and check the window. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was full of messages. 3 different parents had seen the same van. One said it had stopped outside their driveway while their kids were out front. Another claimed the driver rolled down the window and called something out before speeding off. People started sharing their own camera footage, and by noon, the van had been spotted across several streets. A few of the recordings even showed it stopping near kids walking alone. None of us could make out the driver's face. 2 days later, Dad got a call from a detective. They confirmed the van matched the description of one used in an attempted child abduction 2 towns away. Same make, same dented rear door, same partial license plate. They said the suspect hadn't been caught yet but was being tracked. When Dad told me, I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Caleb's candy bucket still half full, realizing how close we might have been to something terrible. It's the kind of thing you never expect to touch your family until it does. Even now, years later, every Halloween feels different. I still walk Caleb, well, not so little anymore, around the block. But I catch myself scanning every car that passes. I know most people out there are harmless, just living their lives. But that night taught me something I can't unlearn. Sometimes the real monsters don't wear masks, and they're not inside haunted houses. They're parked quietly on the corner, waiting for you to stop paying attention. There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory like scars, and that night became one of them for me. I had planned it for weeks, just a simple Halloween night with my son, Miles. He was 8, full of energy, and had been talking for days about dressing as a pirate. We lived in a quiet suburb where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where people waved from their driveways and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. I remember tightening the strap of his plastic sword before we left, his small hands clutching the candy bucket shaped like a pumpkin. The air smelled like wet leaves and cheap fog machine smoke. Every porch flickered orange, and the whole neighborhood glowed with that soft excitement only Halloween brings. We walked house to house, laughing when Miles tripped over his costume or shouted "thank you" through his plastic mask. He was proud of how heavy his bucket had gotten. At some point, we joined a small group of families moving down the main street. Kids darting between lawns, parents chatting behind them. Everything felt safe, almost too perfect. It happened when we reached the corner house with the strobe lights and fake tombstones. I turned to greet one of the neighbors, a man I'd seen walking his dog a few times. And in that brief turn, Miles was gone. I called his name, expecting him to pop out from behind a bush or jump scare me like he loved to do. When he didn't answer, the laughter around me blurred into background noise. I checked the yard, then the sidewalk, then ran toward the end of the street. He was nowhere. His candy bucket lay tipped over near the curb, candy scattered across the wet grass. I started asking around, parents, kids, anyone. Most of them shook their heads, saying they hadn't noticed him wander off. But one woman mentioned seeing a firefighter leading a little boy toward a white SUV. She thought it was just a parent helping their kid get home early. I ran down the block, searching for the vehicle, but the street was crowded, headlights flashing everywhere. By the time the police arrived, the neighborhood had gone quiet, and the house where we'd stopped, the one with the fake tombstones, had its lights off. The officers asked me to describe exactly what I saw, and I kept repeating the same useless details: the flashing strobe lights, the fake fog, the sound of kids laughing. I pointed to the house, insisting that was where we had been standing. But when they checked, the place looked completely different. The decorations were gone, the porch was dark, and the windows were covered with wooden boards that looked like they had been there for years. I remember standing there completely confused, as if the whole setup had been erased in minutes. The officer shone his flashlight on the ground where Miles's candy had spilled, and the reflection of the wrappers looked almost metallic under the beam. They questioned every neighbor on that street, but nobody could say who lived in that house. One man swore it had been vacant since he moved there, and another said it used to belong to an elderly couple who'd passed away years ago. No one had seen anyone move in or out recently. When they pulled up property records, there wasn't even a registered address matching that spot anymore. It was just listed as a lot, with no dwelling number. The more the police checked, the more everything stopped making sense. I stayed out until dawn, calling his name until my voice cracked. Every shadow looked like him for a second. Every distant laugh made my heart leap. The officers promised to keep searching, but as the days passed, their updates became shorter, less hopeful. They found no tire marks matching an SUV, no security footage that captured a firefighter costume, and no candy wrappers from the brand Miles loved near the area where I found his bucket. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole. Weeks later, I started walking that same route every evening after work. The house was still there, or what looked like a version of it. The boards, the empty porch, the uneven lawn. But every now and then I'd see something out of place, a faint orange glow behind one of the boarded windows, or the flicker of a strobe light for half a second before it vanished. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined that house. One night near the end of that month, I parked across from the empty lot and just sat there with the engine off. The street was silent except for the hum of distant traffic. Then, right around the same hour when Miles disappeared, the porch light came on. It was faint, like a bulb struggling to stay alive, but it was there. The fog drifted across the yard exactly the way it had that night. I got out of the car and walked closer, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. From the sidewalk, I could hear faint laughter inside the house. Kids' voices, giggling, echoing through the boards. When I called out, everything stopped. No sound, no light, just the cold air moving through the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever before forcing myself to leave. The next morning I returned with an officer, but the house was gone again. Just grass and dirt where it had stood hours earlier. He told me to take a break from the area, said grief can twist perception, but I wasn't confused. I knew where I had been. I knew what I saw. Months later, a neighbor I barely knew slipped a small object into my mailbox. A plastic pirate sword, broken near the handle. The same cheap kind I had tightened for miles that night. No note, no explanation. I called the police, but they couldn't trace who left it. They said maybe it was someone's idea of a cruel prank. I stopped pushing after that. I stopped talking about it altogether. It has been years now, and Halloween still makes me uneasy. Every October, I think about that flickering porch light and the laughter behind those boarded windows. Sometimes I drive through the old neighborhood, half hoping to see that house again, half dreading it. No one ever found Miles, and no one ever found that white SUV. But some nights I swear I can still hear his voice, faint and distant, calling from somewhere down that same street, asking if we can visit just one more house. The night air carried that mix of cold and leftover smoke from bonfires people light around Halloween. I had spent the evening at a small get-together hosted by an old college friend, someone who still thought themed costumes were mandatory no matter how old we got. By the time I left, it was past midnight, and the roads were almost empty. The party had been out in a rural area where the highway cuts through long stretches of pine and farmland, the kind of place where your headlights feel like the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing the world. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no music, just the hum of my tires against the pavement. A few miles down, I saw red and blue flashes reflecting off the trees ahead. My first thought was that there'd been an accident or maybe a drunk driving checkpoint since it was Halloween night. As I slowed, I could make out two figures in reflective jackets standing near orange cones. A patrol car parked slightly crooked on the shoulder with its lights spinning. One of the men motioned for me to pull over. His hand movements were quick, almost impatient, and I remember how oddly close the other figure stood to him, not really doing anything, just watching. I rolled down my window halfway and greeted the one who approached. He leaned down and asked for my license in a tone that was polite, but clipped, like someone repeating a rehearsed line. Something about his voice didn't match the badge glinting under the lights. It sounded too young. When I handed over my license, his flashlight swept through the car interior longer than necessary, pausing on the passenger seat. Behind him, the second man was pacing, not really paying attention to the supposed checkpoint duties, just circling slowly, boots crunching gravel. Except they weren't boots. When he stepped closer, the reflective light caught white sneakers. That small detail sank in slower than it should have. I glanced at the patrol car again, noticing how its paint looked duller, like an old vehicle that had been resprayed. The markings seemed slightly off, too close together. My nerves prickled and I started to ask which department they were from, but before I could finish, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Bright, steady, moving fast. A second later, the sound of a real siren cut through the night. The man holding my license froze for a second, then suddenly turned and shouted something I couldn't make out. Both of them bolted toward the tree line, disappearing into the woods, as the new cruiser rolled up behind me. The real officer who stepped out of the cruiser was older, with a calm expression that didn't match the chaos I'd just witnessed. He asked me to keep my hands visible, and then approached cautiously, flashlight steady. I told him what had happened, how two men had stopped me and taken my license before running off. He immediately called something into his radio and told me to stay in the car. More patrol cars started arriving within minutes, their lights bouncing off the trees like some kind of eerie warning. One of the officers shined a light into the woods, revealing a narrow trail of footprints heading downhill toward a creek. When they found my license, it was lying near the cones, half buried in the gravel, along with a few others. There were at least 5 IDs scattered around, a pair of zip ties, and what looked like an imitation badge. The fake patrol car turned out to be an old sedan painted over with magnetic decals that peeled when the officers touched them. It made my skin crawl to think how easily they could have fooled someone else. If the real cruiser had not shown up, I had no idea what those men were planning to do. The thought kept looping in my head while I waited inside my car, engine still running, heat blowing through the vents. They asked if I could describe the men, but all I could really say was that one was tall with a shaved head, and the other had a heavy build, wearing that ridiculous pair of sneakers. Both wore jackets with reflective strips, but they didn't match. One had a tear near the shoulder, the other looked new. The officers exchanged glances when I said that. One of them mentioned quietly that there had been similar fake checkpoints reported earlier that night on other roads nearby. That hit me harder than anything. It meant these guys weren't improvising. They had planned this, maybe even rehearsed it. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The adrenaline had drained out, leaving behind this dull, heavy feeling that sat in my chest. My phone kept lighting up with missed calls and messages from friends asking if I'd gotten home safely. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them yet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crooked badge glinting under the patrol lights and those sneakers moving toward the shadows. Even weeks later, when I drove past that stretch of highway, I caught myself slowing down, half expecting to see those fake officers again. A few days later, a detective from the county sheriff's office called to follow up. He said the men who fled my stop were still being identified but had likely been involved in similar setups on other rural roads that same night. Apparently, they targeted people driving alone, mostly women heading home late. The detail made my stomach twist. He thanked me for staying calm and reporting everything clearly. I did not feel calm. Every part of that night still replayed in fragments. The fake car, the crooked badge, the way one of them kept circling like he was waiting for the right moment. For weeks after that, I avoided driving alone at night. If I had to, I kept my phone on speaker with someone from my family while I drove, headlights locked on the road ahead. Friends would tease me about being paranoid, but then the news broke about another checkpoint, this time 2 counties over. Same fake patrol lights, same reflective jackets. The victims in that case had driven straight through without stopping, and that probably saved them. I remember thinking how close I had come to not being one of the lucky ones. The sheriff's office later confirmed the fake patrol car had been reported stolen from a small auction lot. The IDs they found by the cones belonged to people who had been robbed weeks before in nearby towns. It was like these men collected trophies, pieces of other people's lives to make their act seem more believable. I never found out if they were caught. The calls stopped coming, and eventually the story faded from the local news. But I never drove that stretch of highway again. Even now, years later, every time I see flashing lights on a dark road, my heart races before logic catches up. I pull over only in well-lit places, and I double-check every badge and uniform I see. I know those men are probably long gone, maybe even caught, but the fear they left behind still rides with me. Sometimes when the wind rustles through the trees at night, and I catch a glimpse of red and blue through the branches, I have to remind myself it is only passing traffic, and not the echo of that Halloween when monsters dressed as cops tried to make me disappear.